Chapter 591. Making a Covenant _3. The world barrier was nearly sliced open, and the laws from the alien realm were starting to seep through, but this actually didn't make sense, for the erosion of another world should not be so crude. The purpose of erosion was to devour and merge, not to exhaust one's own strength grinding down the others. If the erosion of a world cost far more than what was gained after the devouring, then it would be a meaningless act, but that was not the case now. Injuring the enemy at the cost of one's own far greater harm seemed to trigger some taboo, prompting the power from the alien realm to launch a relentless assault on Hemenu without concern for the consequences. Why is this happening? Just because I wanted to kill those mortals. Baffled and even more infuriated, Lane hadn't expected such a massive response to his minor action. Were those mortals really that important? So should he stop?
No.
Of course, he couldn't stop. Even though this interworld turbulence even affected the deities who enacted the laws and even himself, who was more closely tied to the world, he saw no reason to step back. To locate the enemy's Achilles heel, only to back down due to their fervent reaction. What a ludicrous choice. The more the enemy wished for him not to do something, the more he wanted to do it. Shu, come to me. Inheriting a part of Amon's strength had indeed made Lane stronger, but also laid upon him the responsibility as one of the four barriers of the world, the absolute space. He had to quickly strengthen the world's barrier and not allow the power of the alien realm to invade. But the other deities differed. Even if affected, their strength was beyond any mortal's ability to confront. They just needed to send storms and disasters, let the dynasties of the mortal realm kill them, and nothing would change. He was curious to see what was so special about these mortals with alien realm bloodlines. Chaos. Underworld. Realm of lightness. When the world's strength suddenly surged, naturally not only Hemenu was affected. As the one actively assaulting, Chaos was equally affected. But an offensive bore only losses whereas defense could be ruined, which meant that what Chaos really sensed were only the primordial deities, and their perception was merely that the world's strength had, for unknown reasons, suddenly burst forth like floodgates thrown open. Despite the torrential outpouring, the magnitude of the world was still unimaginable. Yet some things were inevitably affected. What's happened? At some point, the domain no outsider had entered had changed. Deep within the realm of lightness, it seemed something extra had emerged. But Erebus had never changed. He looked into the distance, a hint of confusion in his gaze. What was Chaos attacking the spirit realm? No, more likely the place Nyx had visited before. With a sudden realization, Erebus felt it should be so. But with this, his plans were probably going to be impacted. Not necessarily. His gaze swept across the outside world. Erebus looked toward the mortal world. He saw Silver Moon City, saw those mortals who believed in the spirit realm, saw traces where angels had been active. Finally, his gaze settled on Mount Olympus. The trouble with primordial gods is that they find it hard to die. Lane, I hope your sword is sharp enough. With a slight chuckle, Erebus stepped out, heading toward Mount of the Gods. Everyone has their desires. Lane seemed to wish to break the current world's shackles, to take the spirit realm even further. Zeus wanted to dominate the world, to become the true king of all gods, and what he wanted was simple, just to die. That's not too much to ask, is it? Whether it's the world, an individual, or a deity, Erebus genuinely hoped that someone would come to kill him. Chapter 592. Secret Talks. Mount Olympus, Golden Palace. The great hall was still filled with song and dance, while Hera sat expressionless on the side. Ares, pushing aside Hebe, the goddess of youth, who was pouring nectar, stood beside the divine king, chattering non-stop. He was complaining to Zeus about Athena, describing how intolerably oppressive she was. Father, Athena has gone too far. Do you know how mortals are now judging me? With an unpleasant expression, Ares knew that his experiences were no secret. On the contrary, he had long become a laughingstock among the gods. The cause of the matter was quite simple, stemming from an old affair years ago. Theseus, the then king of Athens in his youth, had his most famous adventure, which was winning the heart of Hippolyta, the Amazon queen. At that time, Theseus was so handsome and wise. He wasn't captivated by the queen's charm but rather made Hippolyta fall for him. Of course, he ultimately did not marry her but later took the daughter of the king of Crete as his queen. Hippolyta, enraged, personally led the Amazons across the sea to attack Athens. However, it was clear that they suffered a great defeat before this eastern city, which also led to widespread questioning of the war god's power among mortals. As the Amazon queen favored by both the war god and the goddess of beauty, she had not only failed to display her exceptional charm to make the king of Athens her subordinate, but was instead attracted by him. And when Hippolyta resorted to war, she still faced defeat, which had a considerable and profound impact. Among mortals, there had long been debates about whether the substance brought by wisdom or the appearance brought by looks was more important, supported respectively by the followers of Athena and Aphrodite. This episode of love and hatred between Hippolyta and Theseus undoubtedly added strong evidence to the former. Of course, considering that appearance is innate and wisdom can be learned later, these two aspects, although contradictory, had never turned into an either-or zero-sum game. However, war was different. Athena and Ares, the two deities most worshipped during the outbreak of mortal wars. But when the war god was defeated in the domains of mortals by Athens, his followers' faith was naturally shaken. Perhaps you should limit her somewhat, father. As far as I know, Athens has never shunned witchcraft and even traded with those heretics. Grinding his teeth, Ares spoke as Aphrodite had advised him beforehand. In this regard, Zeus and his dear sister had erupted in argument more than once, though nothing had ever come of these disputes. Still, voicing this issue was sure to significantly provoke the divine king's displeasure. Having spoken, Ares thought Zeus would say something. In accordance with what Aphrodite had told him, even if the divine king didn't want to deal with the matter, he would still feel increased discontent towards Athena. However, after waiting and waiting, even when many deities subtly turned their gazes towards the head of the table, he heard nothing. By Ares' nature, just coming to complain was already embarrassing enough, let alone being observed by others. Cruel emotions surged up in his heart, and under the influence of his godhood, Ares' eyes reddened briefly. "What are you thinking?" Snapping out of his thoughts, Zeus looked up only to see Ares watching him with red eyes. Frowning slightly, the divine king asked somewhat displeased, "Father God, all right, we'll talk about your issue later. I have some things to handle." Zeus waved his hands slightly, not wanting to speak more with this son whom he didn't particularly like. Recalling the fleeting familiar sensation that had just jolted him awake, Zeus rose from his seat. The banquet of the gods never required constant attendance, and deities leaving or joining midway was not uncommon. Thus, Zeus's departure did not attract attention, leaving Ares behind to be interrupted just as he was about to speak. "Damn it! It's the same again, you never really cared about me. Huh! I am the war god. But why haven't you granted me invincible strength?" Taking a deep breath, this wasn't the first time Ares had faced this situation. With his role as the war god, combat was one of the few things he could engage in, yet there were still many who could defeat him. Suppressing the violent emotions in his heart, the war god looked towards Hera beside him. If it hadn't been for Aphrodite's reminder, he wouldn't have noticed that the mother goddess had somehow been injured a while ago. Perhaps he should go and express his concern. After all, Hera stood by his side in many ways. Aphrodite really is a good wife. He quietly sighed to himself, realizing he had never really observed carefully. Ares felt that, at least in this aspect, fate still favored him. There had been rumors among the gods before, claiming that Aphrodite was seen with other male deities. But how could that be? He was clearly her favorite. Just like that presumptuous cripple, Ares had never really considered him worthy of attention. On the slopes of Mount Olympus, a precarious cliff, the disturbances from the world power were becoming more distinct, like digging a hole in a river embankment. At first, it was just a small leakage, but as time passed, the flow became increasingly vast. However, the gods on the mountain were oblivious to these fluctuations, nor could they detect disturbances of that magnitude. Perhaps only those who had reached the pinnacle of true godhood were slightly aware, but even they could not be as clear as the primordial gods. However, the divine king was an exception, even a special case. In this regard, Zeus's sense was much clearer than Erebus's. As the chosen divine king of this era, he had actually noticed the abnormal fluctuations in the world power for nearly 1,000 years. At first, he did not know the reason behind it, but because it coincided with the aftermath of Typhon, Zeus attributed it to the influence of the mother tree. Only today, when those fluctuations began to surge at an unnatural pace, even faintly causing a chain reaction, did the divine king finally realize something was amiss. It was not due to any internal factors, but external. Zeus was pondering this matter just now. However, recognizing it was one thing, there was little the divine king could actually do. Sovereignty might enable greater strength in one's own dominion, but it also meant deeper weakness in lands not his own. Therefore, even knowing about the existence of an alien realm, Zeus could merely enrich his knowledge. But it seems someone does not think so. His heart stirred slightly. Standing on the cliff, Zeus looked towards a shadow not far away. If it were 1,000 years ago, he might not have noticed the other, but now he could. Lord Erebus, it has indeed been a long time. You look the same as ever. The last gift you gave me, I still vividly remember. Just a small reminder. But seeing your surprise and disarray when facing Typhon, you didn't heed my warning. A voice came from the shadow as Erebus stepped out. He surveyed the majestic mount of the gods, glanced over deities whose aura was either bright or hidden, then fixed his gaze deep into the temporal space. Is that the divine kingdom you created, modeled after the spirit realm? Yes, but Lord Erebus, Typhon is already in the past. Its failure is known to all. As for the Asgard, if you are interested, you could join me to have a look. Let's say that for later. I am here on serious business. Erebus waved his hand slightly. He was not interested in such a divine kingdom, especially the Olympus version. Mortals do not understand, but he saw very clearly that this so-called divine kingdom, where gods and mortals coexist, was somewhat of a scam. It wasn't entirely false. The souls of the devout believers who died did indeed get collected there. They could even communicate with their ancestral souls by making substantial contributions to the corresponding church. However, in other aspects, the gods' descriptions of this place were somewhat misleading. For instance, one could not live forever here. How long a soul could stay depended largely on their descendants' status in the mortal realm. The souls of common people generally wouldn't stay long before returning to samsara, while only the ancestors of the strong and the aristocrats could reside here indefinitely. In this case, the eternal residence in the divine kingdom after death is indeed no falsehood, and the spirit realm had made no response to this, for over 99% of souls would still return to samsara, only delayed a bit. And those mortals who witnessed the return of the deceased souls in the form of holy spirits naturally had unwavering faith in the Church's doctrine. But that's only because you have no other choice. In fact, if possible, you wouldn't want to take such a troublesome approach, especially since followers of the spirit realm blatantly claim the Olympus are false gods, and your implied attacks on their human kingdoms have repeatedly failed. You clearly know there are mortals there denigrating and mocking you, but as the divine king, you could do nothing. Despite your continual oppression, there are still mortals who thus doubt your might. Even your progeny question the power of the deity, even daring to kill their own son in arrogance to test the deities. Somewhat silent, Zeus knew who Erebus was talking about. Tantalus, his blood descendant in the mortal realm, whom he initially so loved that he allowed him to dine with the gods and freely travel between Olympus and the mortal realm. But gradually, perhaps due to his arrogance, or truly under the influence of heretics, Tantalus began to challenge the authority of the gods. He leaked the secrets discussed among deities at feasts to mortals, stole the divine nectar and food from Mount Olympus, and shared them with his mortal friends. He even stole sacrifices that mortals offered to Zeus. Until this point, the divine king still tolerated his actions, for as his progeny not being born a deity, taking pleasure in mortal freedoms wasn't so bad. Until the day when Tantalus invited the gods to his home as guests, to utterly deny divine authority, He killed his own son, also Zeus's grandchild. He cooked Pelops, roasting and boiling him, and served him to the gods as a dish. The gods, of course, realized this, and since it was the divine king's family matter, nobody pointed it out first. They just avoided the dish out of respect. Only the absent-minded goddess of agriculture unintentionally ate a piece, specifically her great-nephew's shoulder bone. Zeus was enraged, and for this, he meted out eternal punishment to Tantalus. But this test itself had always been a thorn in the divine king's heart. So what are you trying to say? As the divine king, I will not violate the iron laws of this era. Even if you want to act in this world, I must stop you. This is the responsibility bestowed upon me by the world, not swayed by my personal preferences. His expression flickered slightly. Zeus didn't know why the Lord of Darkness was bringing these matters up. He had thought the other came due to the fluctuations in world power, wanting to make use of him, the divine king, but now it seemed he was targeting the spirit realm. I know, I'm just asking. If given a chance, one that could eliminate those mortals who scorn you, one that could bolster your authority, enhance your strength, would you take it? Ignoring Zeus's words, Erebus asked again. What are you trying to do? It's what you want to do. Nodding slightly, Erebus spoke slowly. You want to be the ruler of this world as its divine king. And I can help you. That is my purpose here. As for how everything starts, since it arises from the mortal realm, it naturally starts in the mortal realm. Chapter 593, each harboring their own schemes. Erebus's plan was simple, so simple that it hardly counted as a plan at all. He merely outlined a hypothetical situation. As long as Zeus could somehow provoke Lane into striking first, Erebus would follow through on his promise and immediately come to his aid, and perhaps he wouldn't be alone in doing so. Beyond Zeus and himself, he had thought of several beings who could pose a threat to Lane. And they had ample reasons to act against him, reasons that could even become a problem for Zeus after everything had ended. Yes, a problem for Zeus, since he never really intended to create a divine king who would rule over everything. And once he achieved his desires, the existence of the divine king would become a nuisance. It sounds feasible, but how do you plan to guarantee you'll keep your word? The Styx River cannot bind you. That is something we both know, Zeus said. Standing on the edge of the cliff, Zeus pondered for a moment. He seemed somewhat intrigued, but inwardly he became vigilant. The abnormal dissipation of the world's power clearly indicated some sort of shift, and the fact that the Lord of Darkness had chosen this moment to meet with him suggested a scheme that went against the world's laws. Ignoring the other's intentions was the best strategy when in the dark about their plans. As long as he didn't take the bait, he would never be at a loss. However, as he was about to speak, Zeus hesitated, realizing that even though Erebus might have his own agenda, this might also represent a different opportunity for him. The Lord of Darkness wanted him to target the spirit realm and exaggerate its threat. But was the spirit realm truly his greatest enemy at the moment? Perhaps not. In truth, the damage was more a loss of face, and its actual impact on the Olympian pantheon was not as significant as it seemed. Years of hard work by Zeus and the other deities were not in vain. Humans with divine blood had already spread across the land, and those born of noble blood naturally became an indispensable part of the ruling classes. Not every one of them revered the all-gods, and among these demigods were rebellious figures like Tantalus, but in any case, they were generally proud of the divine blood running through their veins. They often saw themselves as superior to everyone else, and to those below, the social hierarchy was clear-cut. This could be said to be the inner portrayal of many deity-blooded aristocrats. On one hand, they saw themselves as entitled to a status comparable to the gods, questioning the strength of the deities, believing they were nothing special. On the other hand, they felt that, compared to mortals without divine blood, demigods belonged to a completely distinct class. They were born rulers, and mortals their servants to command. In this context, the teachings of Silver Moon City, which denied the all-gods, were in fact denying the divinely ordained nobility of these aristocrats. The devout followers of the Olympian gods would not compromise with Silver Moon City, and neither would the power-wielding humans who might not be devout. This was why several failed campaigns hinted at by the deities did not shake the faith in the Olympian pantheon. It remained as stable as Mount Olympus in the mortal realm. Interests were the fundamental root of everything, and over the years Zeus had figured out a way to deal with humans. By comparison, he deemed the actions of Silver Moon City too naive. If this world lacked transcendental powers, without the bloodline of the deities, then perhaps their self-aggrandizing teachings might indeed have an advantage. But reality contained no such ifs, making their extremist ideology a form of bondage instead. Having understood all this, things became clear. Perhaps the existence of Silver Moon City was not so crucial, and even defeating them wouldn't cause a qualitative change in the faith Zeus would acquire, but a true war that involved all gods and humans might. The Olympian pantheon had ruled the world for thousands of years, and it was no longer as fragile as it had been at its inception. The current divine king was not the same as when he had first ascended to the throne. His progeny grew more numerous and more powerful, with beings chanting Zeus's name filling the skies and the earth from past to future. Maybe now was the time for him to clean up some of the remnants of old troubles. Take for example those Titans deities who do not obey commands and proclaim themselves kings in the starry skies, the ocean god who has not formally submitted to him, and even Hades who after marrying the queen of the underworld, has been growing more distant from Olympus, acting in secrecy within his own domain. Their obedience to him is nothing but superficial, resulting in Zeus's sovereign not gaining much strength. Therefore, he now needs a war, not to flatten Silver Moon City or defeat the ancient gods in the spirit realm. His real intent is to use this as a pretext to involve all gods in this war. Whether he can defeat Lane is not important. It would be good if he can, but it doesn't really matter if he can't. Zeus is not so arrogant as to think that he can invade the spirit realm right now. That is something he needs to consider only after he has truly unified the present world. What he really needs is to use this opportunity to clear up the troubles left over from the past. By that time, once his sovereign encompasses the stars and the ocean, the mountains, and the netherworld, under the favored law of reality, perhaps even Erebus would no longer be his match. On that day, he will truly be the ruler of all gods. Give me your assurance. I can take the initiative, but you can't just sit back and watch. It seemed like a long time had passed, but it was only a moment. Zeus looked as if he had been persuaded by the Lord of Darkness, but his expression still held some hesitation. Assurance? What kind of assurance do you want? In response to the question, Erebus smiled secretly as he looked at Zeus, who seemed somewhat tempted. The assurance didn't matter. As long as Zeus was willing to take the lead, that was all he needed, and he had no intention of breaking the agreement. As soon as Zeus acted, he would follow suit. Erebus had prepared for both victory and defeat in dealing with Lane. No matter what, he was certain to engage in a battle. 3 conditions. First, your forces in the mortal realm must join the war, namely those beings who dwell beneath the earth. They must act together with the followers of Olympus. Second, you must hand over the golden apple tree to me. From then on, the goddess of life will become a permanent part of the divine court, with no further connection to you. And lastly, I want you to convince those underworld deities to secretly serve me. As far as I know, they were born by the power you and Mother Night called upon during the end of the First Era. Mother Night has never inquired about their existence, nor has she ever treated them as her offspring. You have done the same before. But if you are willing to speak now, they would know whom to pledge their loyalty to. 3 conditions, not difficult. But Zeus, I am exerting effort for you, aren't I? Why does it seem as though I am working for you? With an unchanged smile, Erebus spoke casually. Working for me? Zeus shook his head slightly and said indifferently, until I understand what the fluctuations of the world power truly mean for you, I certainly won't make such a hasty decision. The arena fell silent for a moment. The weakening of world power certainly means that things that conflict with the laws of the world can be accomplished more easily. The divine king and the primordial gods looked at each other for a while, and then averted their gaze. Perhaps they both had their own thoughts, but at least one thing was the same for now. They both felt they should take action against Silver Moon City, and they also believed a divine war with the gods of the spirit realm was necessary. And Lane's existence was the final boss of this war. I accept your terms. The Dark Elves have multiplied, and the golden apples aren't as important to them anymore. You'll get what you want, but I expect action from you. You'll see it, and the turn of events will definitely surprise you." Exhaling, Zeus nodded in satisfaction. Another of his troubles eliminated. As one of the 12 pillars supporting sovereignty, the goddess of life's essence was not on Mount Olympus, but under the control of the Lord of Darkness, a fact Zeus had only recently discovered, causing a constant thorn in his side. Now having the opportunity to resolve this issue was one less worry for him. As for the other two conditions, let's not speak of the latter. The main reason for the former was that Zeus really feared that Lane might not be drawn out before Olympian forces might fail to defeat Silver Moon City in the mortal realm. Although this possibility was not very high, since previous conflicts were mostly carried out under the hint of the gods, and it was just the individual actions of some mortal kingdom, failure was inevitable. However, just to be safe and to get Erebus more deeply involved, Zeus still put forward this request. With terms agreed upon and matters decided, everything was roughly arranged like so. The two exchanged a few more details, and soon, just as he had arrived, the silhouette of the Lord of Darkness silently vanished from the Mount of the Gods. Standing alone on the cliff, Zeus didn't rush to leave. He just stood quietly for a while, then heaved a sigh. Athena, muttering the name of his most outstanding daughter, who was also the most distant from him, Zeus felt a tinge of regret. In recent years, she had spent most of her time in the stars, and even seldom came to Mount Olympus. "So, what are you thinking?" No matter what she was thinking, Zeus was about to do something. How to stir up disputes, how to intensify contradictions, how to gradually turn a war among mortals into a war among gods, and finally achieve his own goals. All of this gradually took shape in the Divine King's mind during the conversation. However, he needed a catalyst, not just the Divine King leading the Olympian gods to attack Silver Moon City. "After all, it's you who have gone too far." After a long silence, with a flash of lightning, Zeus returned to the banquet in the Golden Palace. The heavenly Empress still sat on the golden throne, with Ares beside her. All the gods were busy with their own affairs. No one noticed the Divine King's return. And looking at his Queen of Gods, Zeus inwardly nodded. Hera thought he didn't know what she had done. Massacres, blood sacrifices, there was nothing her church couldn't do. However, for various reasons, the Divine King had pretended not to notice this. Now, of course, he would continue to act as if nothing had happened, and even encourage her to increase her efforts. The sun suddenly brightened and dimmed. Heliopolis was already in total chaos at this moment. Yet far away in Midian, these storms had yet to reach this place. In a daze, Mes stood at the base of the hill, feeling as if everything that had just transpired was but a dream. Thud! The staff lightly touched the ground, and the solid sensation brought Mes back to reality. When he had left the dwelling of the gods and returned to this hill, the bush that had been untouched by fire had turned into a staff. This was a gift from God to protect himself, but it had no divine power now. Only when he returned to his tribe and began his mission would it gradually become extraordinary. "I should leave this place. I must return to Egypt." Touching his fiercely beating chest, Mes steadied himself. He had been away for 40 years. He wondered how the Hebrews had fared in his absence. Chapter 594. Make a move. As times began to advance, the living bore the destiny of the dead, and the day in the world of Hemenu was indeed bustling. Leaving this unnamed hill, Mes returned to his family and friends. He proclaimed to them that he had received divine revelation, except for his mother-in-law, belonging to the Midianite priest. He claimed he was about to go to Egypt, following the will of God, to rescue his own people, and not even the Egyptian gods who resided above Heliopolis could stop him. He was prepared for this, yet, as was to be expected, Mes' words and actions were met with skepticism. No one believed that this 80-year-old man truly received grace from God, especially not from those well-known deities but from one that only existed in Hebrew mythology and had never manifested. Rather than divine revelation, they were more inclined to believe that Mes, struck by his reminiscence and guilt towards his people, was suffering from a mental breakdown, imagining that he had seen a deity. "Father," I understand your attachment to our people, but your idea is somewhat too unrealistic. Mes' eldest son, looking to be in his 30s and dressed simply, was the first to express doubt. There's nothing wrong with wanting to save the Hebrews, but they are now slaves of the Egyptians. Only the Pharaoh has the authority to decide their fates. But who are you to meet the Pharaoh and rescue your kin? As an envoy of God, God is with me, this is not a problem. Mes shook his head, rebutting his own eldest son. But then, his second son stepped forward. Father, I understand your reverence for God, but what is the name of the one you believe in? In Hebrew mythology, only the one who gave you the divine revelation has no name passed down. If someone asks you which God you believe in, are you really unable to answer him? As a mortal, one should not call God by name. Caught off guard at first, but Mes quickly thought of an answer. But naturally, God has a title. If someone asks me, who sent you to rescue the Hebrews, I will tell them, it was the eternal God who sent me. It is the Eternal who sent me to save them, to lead them out of misery and torment. But they will not believe it, retorted Mes' wife immediately. She was a Midianite, the daughter of a Midianite priest, and not having been educated like Mes, she naturally did not revere those unproven divine stories. Once I arrive at the lush banks of the Nile River, back to the land where I grew up as a child, the divine miracles will naturally manifest. So do you wish to leave with me or stay here? Raising his staff, Mes expressed his determination to his family. The discussion lasted from night until morning, with one problem after another being thrown out and then addressed by Mes. He was not usually eloquent, but now he responded fluently. When the sky brightened once again, his family finally, albeit reluctantly, accepted Mes' views. They would follow him, beginning the journey back to Egypt, to the heart of the Hemenu world. It wasn't something that could happen immediately. They still had many preparations to make, such as liquidating assets and gathering supplies. So days went by, and Mes' family's preparations gradually completed, yet they didn't notice that all along, while they were busy, a girl in a green dress stood by watching everything silently. She observed everything but never spoke a word. Present-day mortal realm. Time hurriedly passed, with the days gradually transitioning from midsummer towards its end. Trees under the fierce sun drew water through their roots and transpired it through their leaves. A few insect noises sounded among the trees while the seasonal floral scent drifted from the sides of the path. There were no pedestrians on the dirt road, or rather, there would not naturally be any pedestrians shuttling between different cities in this epoch. Those encountered outside the cities were either transcendents endowed with exceptional skills or, often in groups of hundreds, merchant caravans traveling together. Especially since there had been rumors of a dragon appearing on this road recently, this made most people avoid it as far as possible. Huff! Making me move it again. When I get home, I'll make you do it 100 times. Near a newly dug large pit under the blazing sun, Andrea muttered under her breath while she pushed a corpse to the bottom of the pit with gritted teeth. The first time she did this, Andrea was quite uncomfortable, but now her movements had become more adept. Ah! Finally done. Almost an hour later, Andrea wiped her sweat and threw the shovel aside. She jogged back to where the coach was parked, feeling the cooling effect of the alchemy array. The little princess's face finally showed a sign of revival. Avon, you could have solved this with divine arts. Why did you make me dig? She puffed her cheeks, then realizing it wasn't proper etiquette. Andrea still maintained that aristocratic smile she had learned since childhood. But from her tone, one could clearly hear her fill of grievances. If you just wanted to see me laboring under the sun, you could have just said so. You should call me Mr. Avon. Also, haven't I told you? This is a special course I set up for you. Speaking of which, you have buried so many times now, have you noticed anything? Putting down the book in his hand, Lane looked at the fuming Andrea and showed a smile. Chapter 595. Make a move _2. What can you see from this? What is there to see? Stunned for a moment, Andrea recollected that there was nothing special about the people who had attacked them on the road for various reasons. Neither their strength nor their identities were exceptional. Some barbarians from the northern lands, and some descendants of aristocrats who were stripped of their titles. Is there something wrong with that? Then, Andrea, why are the divine blood nobles nobility? Responding with a question, Lane gently led her on. Because of their bloodline. Divine blood makes it easier for them to excavate the strength within their bodies, and as long as the bloodline isn't too greatly diluted, nearly every one of them can become a professional. With strength comes status. And hereditary strength naturally brings hereditary status. It sounded as though she were reciting from a textbook, but in fact, this was indeed what Andrea's father had told her. She also remembered her father telling her that pure brute force doesn't equate to stable rights. But when strength can both create wealth and bring violence, then strength and rights are synonymous. This was why he turned a blind eye to the edicts from Olympia. His patronage of wizards and promotion of alchemy were not to oppose those Western powers, but because he saw an opportunity in it. The influence of the deity church penetrated the mortal realm, and in many places, it even held more authority than the king. Fundamentally, this was because divine arts were different from the nobility's divine blood. The latter could only bring about violence, whereas the former could also create wealth. The holy water for healing injuries, the divine arts that made agriculture yield abundantly, the armor and weapons made in special ways. With these, the church became an irreplaceable institution. Just like the current Athens, if the Church of Agriculture were to declare its withdrawal from the kingdom, it's likely that the entire nation's food production would drop by more than 30%. And to get out of this situation, witchcraft and alchemy were the methods Theseus had thought of. Here was another group capable of creating wealth and possessing strength. Of course, Theseus was not planning to replace the church with them. At this moment, all he wanted was a second option. Yes, Andrea. Just as you said, hereditary strength brings hereditary status. Nodding her head, Lane showed agreement. Even if they lost their titles, their bloodline itself signifies value. If they wish, they could continue to live a life beyond the reach of ordinary people. But, Andrea, haven't you noticed that there are so many descendants of divine blood in your kingdom who have become bandits? And conversely, there is a scarcity of ordinary professionals. What do you think is the reason for this? Because of the policies my father implemented. There was no need to elaborate, as this was not a secret in contemporary Athens. From the moment the king cancelled the aristocratic councils in various cities, maintaining only the one established in Athens, the intentions of this legendary king had been very clear. And at this moment, compared to the reality, Andrea felt that she indeed understood something more. My father acted too hastily, to the point that he couldn't attend to these trifles. Or perhaps he didn't see these disgruntled nobles as a concern at all. But in reality, they are not without their threats, not just those we encountered on our way, but even during the kidnapping process, someone was leaking information and turning a blind eye to the cultists. By drawing parallels, Andrea felt she had gained a clearer understanding of human nature. In this era, there were no sociologists or psychologists, and almost no one could be truly called a politician. Even the king of Athens was simply instinctively trying to maintain balance. Bolstered by the Church of Knowledge, the state church which did not object, he drew in witchcraft and alchemy. But if Theseus was asked to explain the principles behind this, he likely wouldn't be very clear himself. I understand what you mean now, so I don't have to keep digging holes anymore, right? The first part of the sentence was serious. Then Andrea suddenly changed her tone, her eyes sparkling as she looked at Lane. Of course not. Smiling faintly, Lane shook his head in refusal, then pointed ahead under the furious gaze of the little princess. Let's keep moving. Our journey is still long, and we cannot stop here. You, humph. With a clear snort, Andrea climbed down from the carriage, hung the shovel she had previously tossed aside next to it, and then returned to the driver's seat. The carriage soon resumed its forward motion, and Lane leaned back in the compartment, pretending to doze off. That night, the sky was cloudless. The stars and the bright moon kept company, illuminating the entire night sky. Lane lay back on a large rock, gazing at the starry sky above him. Andrea was sleeping in the carriage, and on this point, Lane did not quarrel with the little princess. Rather, he generally preferred not to stay in the carriage. He preferred to contemplate things in such a silent environment, as if it made his thoughts more active. There was no reason for it, neither physical nor magical, but that's indeed how Lane felt. However, today he faced a difficult problem. Because when he regularly sought sacred power from the serpent of the central court, Lane received an additional piece of information. As a stakeholder in the Nine Hells, the serpent of the central court also felt the abnormal pass of the world power. Others might still be guessing, but Lane knew why. This proved that the divine, far in the alien realm, had already started their plan. Hemenu's destruction was completely on countdown, which also meant that Chaos World was likely to encounter various chaotic events. But the current problem was that Lane, as the part of humanity, had woken up too late. He had not expected to accidentally hit a space-time bubble. In his direct plan, by the time the divine part began to act, his human incarnation should have completed what needed to be done, just waiting for the big show to begin. But now, facing this situation, the problem became conspicuous. He could not be certain what the all-gods who had felt the fluctuation of world power would do, just as Lane was still not sure what Erebus was up to. Lane lay back on a large rock, gazing at the starry sky above him. Andrea was sleeping in the carriage, and on this point, Lane did not quarrel with the little princess. Rather, he generally preferred not to stay in the carriage. He preferred to contemplate things in such a silent environment, as if it made his thoughts more active. There was no reason for it, neither physical nor magical, but that's indeed how Lane felt. However, today he faced a difficult problem. Because when he regularly sought sacred power from the serpent of the central court, Lane received an additional piece of information. As a stakeholder in the Nine Hells, the serpent of the central court also felt the abnormal pass of the world power. Others might still be guessing, but Lane knew why. This proved that the divine, far in the alien realm, had already started their plan. Hemenu's destruction was completely on countdown, which also meant that Chaos World was likely to encounter various chaotic events. But the current problem was that Lane, as the part of humanity, had woken up too late. He had not expected to accidentally hit a space-time bubble. In his direct plan, by the time the divine part began to act, his human incarnation should have completed what needed to be done, just waiting for the big show to begin. But now, facing this situation, the problem became conspicuous. He could not be certain what the all-gods who had felt the fluctuation of world power would do, just as Lane was still not sure what Erebus was up to. Let's see. After all, the worst outcome won't be that bad. After pondering for a moment, Lane still couldn't think of any countermeasure, so he decided to just take it one step at a time. At least he wanted to see first what move the all-gods intended to make. Chapter 596. The Envoy from Olympia. The following day, riding in a carriage, Lane headed south. He didn't stop in several cities he passed, but went straight to Athens. If it had been before, Lane might not have been so direct. Perhaps he would have traveled and experienced the local cultures and peoples like a mortal, but with the disturbances occurring, he clearly wasn't in the mood for that. Lane planned to go somewhere where information was disseminated more quickly to understand what exactly was going on with the world's disturbances. The information obtained from Hell was partial and incomplete, and although there were many of their followers hidden among mortals, they weren't mainstream. In comparison, Athens was different. It's about time this little one proved useful. Narrowing his eyes, sometimes Lane was surprised by the audacity of Hera's followers. Of course, they might not have known the specifics, or perhaps they did know, but their faith in the gods overwhelmed their fear. It should be noted that from the first meeting, Andrea had claimed to be a high-ranking priestess of the goddess. And this wasn't a general term, but a genuine testament to her strength. In today's chaos, people have various ways to classify mortal power, such as the traditional first, second, third, and fourth ranks, or described as black iron, bronze, silver, gold, essentially the same, just different names. There are even spellcasters who straightforwardly determine their ranks by the level of magic net they can contact, dividing them from the first to the ninth ring of wizards, but in fact it's just a different terminology for the former: first rank from 1 to 3 rings, second rank from 4 to 5 rings, and so forth. It's similar for godhood practitioners and even more straightforward. They blatantly categorized the domains below the legendary as low-rank priest and high-rank priest, because the grades of godhood practitioners before reaching legendary mostly stem from divine grants, and if retracted, they revert to being mundane, hence the lack of detailed classifications. They simply used the sixth ring of divine arts as a demarcation to distinguish amongst themselves. Therefore, Andrea's title as a high-ranking priestess holds significant value. If the sacred power in her wasn't sealed by another god's power, she could easily crush the heretics who kidnapped her 10 times over. Such power combined with her age of 12 years old undoubtedly makes Andrea not only the princess of Athens but also a mortal elect directly observed by Athena, possibly even a prospective chief shepherd for the Panhellenic Church of Knowledge in the future. In this context, offering Andrea as a living sacrifice to Hera was no trivial matter. Of course, if it were successful, it likely could indeed cause significant damage both to Athena's mortal faith and to the authority of the royal family of Athens. Leaning against the soft backrest, Lane was pondering the tasks of this journey when suddenly, a commotion from afar caught his attention. As they got closer to Athens, the road widened, and the number of people increased. However, nearly everyone maintained their vigilance as if they were in the wilderness, rarely getting close to each other, at most giving a distant greeting. Lane had never encountered such a loud argument audible from a considerable distance before. "What's the commotion about outside?" Knocking on the doorframe, Lane casually asked. "I'm not sure." Upon hearing Lane's inquiry, Andrea, who was outside the carriage, simply shook her head. "It's a merchant convoy. A caravan from Thebes just passed by. They seemed to be talking about divine election and justice. Then they started arguing. By their words, is there some event being organized? But the Panhellenic Athena Games are still years away. An event? Thebes?" Lifting the curtain, Lane looked outside. Indeed, several hundred meters behind them, a sizable merchant convoy was advancing through a cloud of dust. From their direction, their destination didn't seem to differ from Lane's. They were presumably also heading to Athens. So the so-called event they mentioned could only be occurring in Athens, not in the disaster-stricken Thebes. "Slow down. Let's hear what they're talking about." Instructing Andrea, as the carriage slowed down, Lane immediately gathered a ray of spiritual light in his hand. First ring divine art, the illusory sound art. There is also a corresponding version in witchcraft, or rather, many common divine arts were adapted, plagiarized from witchcraft. It was essentially a divine art for simulating sounds. However, at this moment, its target for simulation was set to the distant, faint sounds of argumentation. Thus, the blurry voices immediately became much clearer, and as the two sides got closer, the conversation seemed to be happening right beside Lane's ear. "Speed up. Olympia. Priest. Wise and just. Selection. Acropolis. Debate. For. Crete. Impossible." The voices were noisy and overlapping. The illusory sound art, being only a first-ring divine art, does not have features like noise reduction, clutter removal, or artificial recognition during the sound transmission process. The amplified sounds of the wind, the carriage's movements, and conversations of nearly 100 people mixed together would be indistinguishable for the average person. Fortunately, neither Lane nor Andrea had problems in this regard. After listening for about half a water clock's time, the two approximately understood the cause and effect inside. About a month ago, roughly half a month after Lane learned of Hemenu's plan, a high-ranking priest from Olympia visited the royal palace in Athens. He met sequentially with the king of Athens and the chief shepherd of the Church of Knowledge, and his stated purpose was to witness the prosperity of Athens. In any era, a nation's prosperity is often reflected in both material and spiritual wealth. Initially, the Athenians thought this priest from Olympia had come to challenge them, holding them accountable for promoting alchemy practices. However, the outcome was surprisingly different. This priest named Noros overlooked the witchcraft and alchemy and instead highly praised Athens's prosperity. Praise from foreigners always had a way of instilling exceptional pride. However, at the end of their visit, in the temple at the Acropolis of Athens, Zeus's chief shepherd proposed an additional minor condition. Members of the Church of Knowledge, I have heard that the honorable and immortal daughter of the divine king, bright-eyed Athena, is a skillful sage, as well as the embodiment of wisdom. From her hands, all sorts of ingenious creations come into existence, and as her sanctuary in the mortal realm, the Athenians must undoubtedly take pride in their wisdom. Furthermore, I have heard, respected king of Athens, that you have married the great Zeus's daughter, daughter of Minos, Hydra. He and his brother Rhadamandes were both kings of Crete and were renowned for their just and strict laws. If you do not mind, Noros proposed to those present at the time, I would like to hold a grand event, an event that can demonstrate people's thoughts and abilities. I will witness the Athenians' justice and wisdom, witness their decisions when faced with choices. At least on the surface, there was nothing wrong with Noros's request. For a country in the mortal realm, hosting a grand event, although consuming fiscal resources, essentially also acts as a declaration of national power and a way to spread the belief in deities. The quadrennial Grand Sports Festival in Olympia, that was a tribute to the divine king and a postponed homage. The triennial Panhellenic Games in Athens was even more so the finest offering to the goddess. Even the athletic event during young Perseus's accidental murder of his grandfather was held for similar reasons. People were eager to participate in such events and willing to spread the name of the winners, making their fame renowned throughout the human world. In such circumstances, the king of Athens, Theseus, had no reason to deny this request, and he chose to accept. Soon, with the help of the church, they constructed a new, massive venue capable of accommodating hundreds of thousands of people. A classical marvel under the influence of transcendent power, located several miles outside the city of Athens, before the Acropolis. The Acropolis of Athens, originally intended for defending against external enemies, had almost never been truly used. In contrast, in its center was Athena's largest temple in the mortal realm, the highly renowned Parthenon Temple. Establishing the venue there naturally carried the intent of offering the grand event to the goddess. And for this action, the far-traveled priest raised no objections. Thus, the matter was settled, and the related information was immediately disseminated worldwide in various ways. Previously, that trading party from Thebes had debated because of this. After all, although the grand event was sudden, many famous sages from foreign lands had come upon hearing the news. The people in the trading party were arguing about the merits of these sages, even though their arguments were only based on possibilities, hearsays, and speculations. So it's like that, a grand event with some elements of debate. Andrea, have you ever seen a similar event? After a moment of thought, Lane spoke up. No, this should be the first time. The Panhellenic Games are competitions of skill and martial prowess, debates and decisions. Such an event has never been held before. Shaking her head, a glint of light flashed in Andrea's eyes. She had never attended a similar event, not even the Panhellenic Games, as she had not been born the last time it was held. She had long been curious about it, but had never had the chance to witness it firsthand. Now, an opportunity had arisen, but she was still a captive. Hey, ahem, Mr. Avon. Sitting up straight, Andrea looked very serious. We're not far from Athens now, right? I mean, once we get there, will you set me free? What do you think? Glancing briefly at the nervous little princess, Lane drew the curtain. Keep moving forward. Don't fantasize about things that won't happen. If I plan to send you home as a gift, why would I bring you all this way? All right. Slightly disappointed, but not overly so. Actually, Andrea hadn't thought that Mr. Avon was in Athens to send her home. He probably had his own matters to attend to. Although there wasn't much interaction during their journey, the little princess realized that this mysterious figure was probably no ordinary person. The more ancient the times, the more limited the dissemination of news. Thus a person's experience and knowledge were largely linked to their status. Although Mr. Avon displayed unfamiliarity and ignorance in many areas, he seemed like a master or key figure of some major power, yet he hadn't really interacted much with the earthly nations. Mr. Avon, there must be something you want me to do. Clenching her small fists, Andrea spoke firmly. Since there's still something for me to contribute to, can I propose some conditions? But you are my captive. Speaking calmly, Lane realized that Andrea probably had never learned the skill of bargaining. And I even saved you. But, you don't even know your own use? Perhaps your usefulness doesn't require active cooperation? Let's set off. Destination: the Acropolis of Athens. With a slight chuckle, Lane casually said, I have not yet met the priest from Olympia. I also want to see what a grand event of this era really looks like. Great! Her voice suddenly filled with more spirit, and the chariot promptly started moving. Lane leaned back, pondering the grand event. It might be a coincidence, but Lane didn't believe in coincidences. In any case, since the priest from Olympia had made such a request at this sensitive time, he had to see it for himself. Chapter 597 Acropolis of Athens. The further south the road went, the more abundant the vegetation and water systems became. Perhaps because the area was often cleared or patrolled, after crossing a wide river, Lane encountered no more trouble upon reaching the plains. Even when occasionally coming across other teams with the same destination, they all gave the alchemy carriage a wide berth, having no intention of approaching. Such an expensive creation was not something the average person could afford to use, and Lane enjoyed the peace. So when the proper position of the stars moved to the location of the sixth house of the zodiac, the lookout point of Athens, the mortal sanctuary of the goddess of wisdom, the Acropolis of Athens was finally within sight. As the carriage climbed a small hill, Lane drew back the curtains and gazed at the distant Acropolis. The real Athens was even further away. In actual history, the distance might not be great, but in the mythic world, it was different. It was the barrier of Athens, the core of the church, and a city built upon a mountain, or rather, a fortress atop a hill. Its true name was the Acropolis, which in the language of the Athenians translates to high city, or city-state on the high hill. In the path of history, this was no more than a small city spanning an area of just 4 square kilometers, renowned solely for its temples that have been passed down through generations. But now it appeared as a truly magnificent wonder. The city walls were built along the mountain, creating multiple barriers, with the natural terrain allowing access to the Acropolis only from the west side. On the east, south, and north sides were steep cliffs, forming a very treacherous terrain. Doric and Ionic columns were ingeniously interspersed in front of the city gate, conveying the solemnity and charm of the city. The city gate was bustling with people, and while the inside of the city was obscured by the walls, making it difficult to view directly with the naked eye, 2 massive columns of light shot up into the sky, still clearly visible even during the day. One rose from the center of the city where towering stone columns, taller than the city walls, were clearly visible even from outside the city. Without a doubt, that was the Parthenon Temple, the sanctuary of Athena. It was said that facing it was another temple, the Erechtheion, where Athena and Poseidon had once allowed the citizens of this city to choose their own faith. Today, it is dedicated to some principal gods of the Olympian pantheon who do not have a clear conflict with Athens, though these deities have not conferred their power there. As for the other column of light, it was probably a bit to the north of the city. Although the architecture could not be seen, Lane had heard that it was the Temple of Artemis, and one of the rare public places of worship for the master of the wilderness, the new moon goddess on earth. As for why, it is said that this goddess harbors animosity towards the divine king of Mount Olympus, though few know why. Andrea, apart from what's in the books, how much more do you know about the new moon goddess? Lane asked as he signaled the carriage to keep moving forward. The records in the Panathena Knowledge Hall were rich but very restrained. In many places, they seemed to skim the surface, like the deeds of Artemis, for instance. Although the new moon goddess was to some extent another protective deity of Athens and a good friend of their revered principal god, the process by which she came to Athens was clearly glossed over with euphemistic expressions. The books faintly implied there was discord between Artemis and some deity. But as to why there was discord and the cause and effect, that was something the books did not record. If you're asking about that, cough cough, it said, I've only heard. Andrea confirmed after coughing lightly, certain that her former self, before being kidnapped, would never discuss matters between deities. But now, after thinking for a moment, she didn't refuse to discuss the gossip about the deities. I once heard a bedtime story my father told about the esteemed Princess Artemis, who originally resided in the southeast of the continent, living in seclusion by Falling Star Lake. There, she hunted and practiced archery every day, running through the wilderness to hone her skill, not seeking to expand her circle of followers. If a mortal were fortunate enough to meet her, they would be subjected to the goddess's trial. If they could hunt the game she designated, the goddess would grant them an additional gift. Of course, the gods are always noble, and Princess Artemis certainly didn't live alone. Besides the moon goddess, who often frolicked with her in a silver chariot, due to her status as the master of the wilderness. Many fairy nymphs born among stones, woodlands, watersheds, and flora naturally gathered around her, recognizing her as their leader. Just as the story depicts, this period of her life was so idyllic that it should have lasted indefinitely, until one day, the king of the gods arrived there with thunder and dark clouds, seeking his own children. At this point, Andrea paused, a slight smile appearing at the corner of her mouth, as if intentionally waiting for Lane to ask about the rest of the story. However, Lane, sitting in the carriage and hearing this, had already gleaned his answer. He simply nodded slightly and with a hint of resignation said, "Ah?" Not expecting such a remark out of the blue, Andrea was taken aback. "Isn't that so?" So the rest of the story goes, the divine king's child he was looking for was actually Artemis herself, but it so happened she was not at home the day he arrived. Thus the esteemed divine king had no choice but to wait there, and he chanced upon her beautiful maid. Much like the new moon goddess herself, her maids were sworn to chastity. So the divine king disguised himself as Artemis to get close to her and ultimately succeeded, just like when he once took on the form of a cuckoo to deceive the trust of Hera. After her return, Artemis was naturally furious beyond measure. She rejected the recognition of the divine king, but since she was no match for Zeus, she couldn't punish or expel this annoying fellow. So she made a swift decision and moved to Athens to keep company with the goddess of wisdom. Is that right? You already know, and yet you ask me. With a snort, Andrea expressed her dissatisfaction. No, I honestly didn't know before, at least not that it would happen here, but this does fit the principal god's character. He always manages to unleash his untapped energy, regardless of whether there's a proper matter at hand or not. Spreading his hands, Lane certainly wouldn't say that there's indeed a chapter like this in the original myth, which led to the birth of the Big Dipper and Little Dipper constellations. He simply attributed it to Zeus's nature. The divine king's flaws in this regard were widely known, and for most mortals at this point in time, Zeus's philandering might not even count as a flaw, as long as Hera's searching presence was not considered. After all, most of their ancestors came to be in such a manner, so naturally, they could not turn around and decry this behavior now. During their casual chat, another curiosity was unraveled, but the carriage did not stop moving. Soon after, the alchemy carriage arrived at the foot of the hill where the Acropolis was located. Not far away, a massive circular building was almost complete, reminiscent of the architectural style of the ancient Roman Colosseum. Except, this arena for selecting the personification of justice and wisdom was round, and there was a floating alchemical platform in the center. It was unclear whether it was prepared for the judges, for those competing, or if Athens was planning to embrace the classical republican tradition and do away with judges altogether, letting the audience decide who the victor was. "Avon, are you sure about just taking me in like this?" Standing outside the circular archway, some distance from the city gate, Andrea raised an eyebrow. "Are you referring to the magic nullification barrier solidified onto this gateway? Don't worry, to ensure you have a disguise art so strong that no amount of magic penetration can break through it, I specifically conducted a god-granted ceremony." Lane wasn't sure if there was a gaming term like magic penetration in this world, but such a coined word could be understood literally after all. Besides, wouldn't it be good if your identity were exposed? You'd quickly be back in your palace as a princess. "Humph. Just make sure you don't get taken down as a kidnapper," she huffed. Puffing her cheeks, Andrea drove the carriage through the arch known as the Gate of True Sight. As a city built in the style of a fortress, it naturally had devices that could detect non-human life, break invisibility, stealth, and altar appearances. However, just as Lane said, Andrea's appearance did not change at all even after passing through the gate. Following the crowd, ascending the slope, Lane and company entered the city without any trouble. Passing through the towering city gate, Lane took note of the high spires on either side. The forces of the elements were gathering at their bases, while at their tips were a pair of objects resembling lightning rods. Seeing this design, Lane couldn't help but recall a magical creation he had once discussed with Hecate using the Tome of All Spells. Back then, he simply remembered a weapon used by an arcane empire in a game he played before coming to this world, but now it seemed to be brought to reality, right? Without first-hand contact, it was premature to jump to conclusions. Since, in all likelihood, the device had not been used since its construction, there had been no enemies who made it to the gates of the Acropolis. Lane wondered if there would ever be an opportunity. Shifting his gaze away, he refocused on the scene beyond the city gate. The cobblestone path led inward, connecting to the city's thoroughfares and alleys. Shimmering crystal lamps hung along the way, meant to provide illumination, though they were unlit since it was daytime. At a glance, houses, public baths, all kinds of workshops were present. And not far from the city gate stood bronze statues of the current king of Athens, Theseus, and the Hydra. Seeing this prompted another mention of Chaos's outrageous actions that spanned from deities to mortals. The father of the current king of Athens, Hydra, was actually the king of Crete, son of Zeus and Europa, previously referred to by the priests of Olympia as the stern and just King Minos. However, in reality, Minos did not get along well with his son-in-law, king of Athens Theseus. According to legend, although Minos was an exemplary king, he probably wasn't a man with a solid moral compass, a common trait among Chaos's mortals. His kingship did not come through inheritance. Instead, he usurped the position from his brother Rhadamanthys. To legitimize his claim to the throne, the king of Crete, quite naturally, turned his gaze to the gods. Zeus was a given, though theoretically his father. Everyone knew what happened between him and Europa, and Hera's infamous jealousy was known the world over, let alone that he had seized his own brother's throne. Therefore, in the end, Minos settled on worshipping Poseidon, the sea emperor. Poseidon was quite pleased with the son of Zeus seeking his blessing, so much so that he didn't just make life difficult for the king. He even offered him a sacrifice, a white bull that emerged from the sea. In theory, all Minos needed to do was to offer the bull, clearly bestowed by Poseidon himself, back to the god, and everything would have been fine and dandy.
No harm, no foul.
But the gods and men of that era were just so audacious. Just like Tantalus, who dared to kill his son and serve him to the gods, this son of Zeus thought he could deceive divine eyes. He was too fond of the beautiful bull to offer it up. So he secretly replaced the sacrifice, keeping the white bull provided by Poseidon for himself. And the outcome was naturally discovered by Poseidon. The enraged sea emperor felt mocked. In layman's terms, she shifted from a preference for men to a penchant peculiar to the Peacock dynasty's aesthetic values. Chapter 598 Thetis. From that day forward, the queen cursed by the gods took more interest in animals than in humans, and the king of Crete evidently could not tolerate such matters happening to his queen. Therefore, to solve the issue, he invited Daedalus to create a wooden cow for Queen Pasiphae, later confining her within it. No one knew why the king did this, since he surprisingly didn't forbid others to touch the wooden cow. There were also rumors claiming that this was a beautified version of history. In fact, Minos was initially unaware of the queen's curse, and the wooden cow had been commissioned by Pasiphae herself to satisfy her bestial desires. In any case, Daedalus truly had unparalleled skill. The wooden cow he built was incredibly lifelike, so much so that even real cows could not distinguish it from one of their own. As a result, the divinely gifted white bull, which had aroused the king's greed, was attracted to it and mated with her. Consequently, Pasiphae became pregnant and gave birth to the monster Minotaur, the bull of Minos, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. It was born with immense strength, so much so that even the king who discovered it could not kill this spawn of misfortune. Of course, it was likely also a matter of not daring to, given that the birth of the Minotaur meant that the white bull was clearly more than just a bull. Such a being could not possibly be born from the union of two mere mortals. No one knew what this white bull really was. Could it be a divine child of Poseidon, or perhaps even an incarnation of the sea god himself? It's no wonder that the sea god had thus placed a curse. In any event, with no other choice, Minos commanded Daedalus and his son Icarus to construct a vast labyrinth to imprison the Minotaur with a man's body and a bull's head. After the labyrinth was built, to keep the secret, Daedalus and his son were also locked inside. However, it was precisely because of this that their eventual escape across the sea and the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun, ultimately leading to his death, came about. The monster imprisoned in the labyrinth craved blood, and infants were thus offered as sacrifices to the Minotaur. This brutal act continued for many years until one day Theseus, who had not yet ascended the throne, arrived. He ventured into the labyrinth, killed the monster, and turned it into an episode within his legendary life, while incidentally taking away Hydra, who later became queen. Of course, according to Lane's conjecture, there was likely an element of transaction in this. The king of Crete, not daring to act himself, let others take the fall, and the young Theseus readily agreed to do so. However, the original mythological Theseus was raised by followers of Poseidon, which is why he had a close relationship with the Sea Emperor, so killing the Minotaur without retaliation. But the current Theseus had no such connection with Poseidon. Given the addition of Princess Andrea of Athens, who was not present in the mythology and just happened to be attacked by the Resurrection Church, followers of Hera on the high seas, plus the king of Athens immediately deciding to go fight an incarnation of a certain sea god. Clearly, it was most likely a joint conspiracy between Hera and her brother, and it had simply failed for now. If you look at it that way, Athens really is making enemies everywhere. Lane silently reflected once again on the absurdity of the human deity of chaos. Minos, such a king, was still universally recognized as a wise ruler. But beyond that, Lane was also aware of the undercurrents beneath the calm surface of Athens. In the realm of deities, it was hard to say which god or goddess on Mount Olympus truly stood with Athena, while Ares, Aphrodite, and Hera were obviously her enemies. In the mortal realm, Athens could hardly speak of allies, both on land and sea. It's a bit strange. Would Athena really let herself fall into such a predicament? He did not know, nor could he make it clear. Lane thought no more of it and had Andrea look for an inn that received foreign visitors. After settling their itinerary and parking their carriage, Lane immediately took Andrea to a place teeming with people. Lane had noticed it upon entering the city. It was a place where the identities of outsiders were registered, and stone badges of varying levels were granted according to the status of the visitors. It wasn't mandatory and the validation of identity was quite lenient. However, considering the assembly that might take place soon, it was feared that an identity would indeed be necessary to gain entry. The two of you, would you like to register for a professional rank or a bloodline rank? Before long, Lane and Andrea arrived at the place. The godhood practitioner in charge of registration lifted his head and smiled politely. Bloodline rank. Lane spoke softly, giving a hint with his eyes. Andrea hesitated for a moment but eventually raised her hand to place it on the crystal ball in front of the godhood practitioner. TSSSS. Initially, there was no change. Then in the next moment an intense red light burst forth. The whole crystal ball seemed to turn into a giant magic lamp, illuminating a considerable area around. Many nearby cast curious glances this way, yet no one approached rashly. This is divine blood within 5 generations. A murmured exclamation, but the priest in charge of the test quickly regained his composure. In today's world, having a lineage of deities within 5 generations was uncommon but not rare. It was just unusual to see it in his particular case. Perhaps she was yet another illegitimate daughter of a foreign king, much like the king of Athens before his ascension to the throne, or even simply a princess of some country. In fact, demigods of this level gathered by the hundreds, if not 1,000, at the Panhellenic Athena athletic competitions held every 30 years. Even now there were many, although most would reveal their identities directly to be received by the church and the king. It was rare for someone to come here themselves to obtain a temporary identity token. This is your temporary stone badge. marked with the trace of the goddess's sacred power. It cannot be forged. If you lose it, please come and register it promptly. The attitude became much more respectful, but as a godhood practitioner, the middle-aged priest was simply following the rules. Thank you. Andrea accepted the stone badge and thanked him politely, while Lane did not proceed with the test. This badge was sufficient, and the priest obviously regarded him as a guard or some similar role, not paying any more attention to him. Didn't you want to keep a low profile? I hardly see how this was low profile. Once the matter was resolved, the two quickly left the area, but they hadn't gone far when Andrea tugged at Lane's clothes. Logically speaking, this choice shouldn't have posed any problems since one of them was a sealed practitioner of Athena and the other belonged to the Hell system of practitioners. Clearly neither could register as professionals. As the daughter of the King of Athens, Andrea was indeed a demigod of the highest tier of bloodline. Anyway, the margin of error in this kind of measurement is huge. You can only roughly determine a category, otherwise we wouldn't have only gotten the answer divine child within 5 generations. But this has nothing to do with hiding one's identity. It's your identity that's hidden, not that you actually have to pretend to be an average person. When you meet someone, you'll have to endure some scoffing, and if a conflict occurs, the likelihood of your exposure increases. To hide in plain sight is an art. One hides in the mountains, another amid the populace, and the greatest hides in plain view of the court. Learn it well. If you were to maintain the identity of an ordinary person, even buying high-tier ritual materials with me could draw unwanted attention. If it were about evading assassination, then of course the more ordinary the better. But knowing that he was here to cause trouble, adopting a high-status disguise might be more effective. In the following period, Lane planned to level up first and then consider how to take part in this bizarre gathering. Intuition told him that something abnormal must be afoot. The Divine King's priest had suddenly made such a request, likely for some reason. But Lane did not fit the role of jumping into the fray and grabbing a championship. Besides, wouldn't it be even more embarrassing if he failed to win? Without considering authority, Lane thought it wiser to be cautious. Regardless, Lane still hoped that the ultimate victor would be his doing, and so, after much thought, he decided that he needed to employ some unfair advantages. To the east of Chaos, the Pontus Euxinus Sea. This was right above the largest trench originally belonging to Chaos, now relegated to second place after the emergence of the Great Maelstrom in the East Sea. This was the birthplace of the ancient sea god Pontus, symbolizing the earth concave, and his final resting place. The area was forever tranquil, for its master instinctively repelled his former adversaries and nephews, the might that belonged to the ruler of ocean currents. Likewise, Poseidon was reluctant to unleash the power of storms here, not wanting to offend the unthreatening ancient sea god. Therefore, many mortals deemed the Pontus Euxinus Sea a dead sea, not devoid of life, but rather like lifeless seawater. Taking into account its slumbering master, this description was quite apartment. Nonetheless, today, the peace of this sea region was shattered by thunder. Boom! Lightning streaked across the sky, clouds morphed into a chariot, a sign of the arrival of the Divine King. Zeus made no effort to hide his approach, and Nereus, the eldest son of Pontus and now steward of the Pontus Euxinus Sea, had long been waiting. "Your Majesty, welcome." The old sea god greeted with a warm smile, paying respects to the Divine King stepping down from the cloud chariot. Zeus reciprocated graciously, laughing as he embraced Nereus. "I'm pleased to see you, Elder of the Ocean. I know my visit today may be somewhat abrupt. I hope you don't mind. As the king of all gods, you have the right to visit any place in this world without prior notice." Ha ha ha. Zeus laughed heartily, waving his hand dismissively. He entered what used to be the divine palace of the ancient sea god, at the invitation of Nereus. The place seemed long deserted. The children of Pontus didn't reside here. Even Nereus had built a new home nearby for himself. However, to show his respect for his guest, he had reopened this dusty palace. As they went further in, Zeus saw many descendants of the ancient sea god, particularly Nereus's daughters. Amphitrite had once been among them, now having become Poseidon's sea empress. I hope they're not all so foolish. Though, clever or not, it doesn't really concern me anymore. With an unchanged expression, Zeus seated himself on the golden throne Nereus had prepared. Sea nymphs performed songs and dances. Many sea gods made toasts, and cups clinked against each other. As time passed, more sea gods who heard the news began to converge here, while the divine king seemed to truly be here just for a banquet, feasting with all gods. Time quickly slipped by. Zeus's cheeks were a bit flushed, seemingly getting slightly drunk. At one moment, he patted the old sea god on the shoulder and suddenly pointed to a dancer below. "Who is she?" "My daughter Thetis. Does her dance please you, your majesty?" Responding with a smile, Nereus glanced at his daughter. Like Amphitrite, she was one of the most beautiful among his 50 daughters. It seemed the divine king had taken a liking to her, right? However, Zeus's next words caused Nereus's heart to skip a beat. "No, Nereus, how could I dare to fancy her? That's impossible." In a haze of tipsiness, Zeus seemed to speak without doubt. "She will give birth to a child more powerful than his father. That's the prophecy and also fate. She is aware of this fact, and the fates know it too. I plan to arrange a blissful marriage for her. What do you think?" "Of course, it would be her honor," Nereus said with an unchanged smile. "Very well, let's do it soon." Zeus nodded, taking another cup of nectar, and then resumed his enjoyment of the entertainment before him. Chapter 599, Opening and the Game. The divine king intended it, and Nereus was not going to refuse. Everything proceeded very smoothly. The paper sprouted wings and flew up from under the heavy seawater, soaring between the heavens and the netherworld. To show his emphasis on this matter, Zeus had invited almost every existing true god in the world, even those reclusive entities from long ago. Of course, invites were just invites. Whether they would come was another matter. Apart from deities who held ancient grudges against the ancient sea god, Zeus also wanted to preemptively gauge his status and influence in the world today. This matter could not be delayed. Thinking about these issues, when Zeus drove his chariot away from the Pontus Euxinus, he suddenly stopped and looked towards the direction of the earth. The Erechtheian temple, although the divine king had never performed a divine miracle there, did not mean he could not use his statue as a medium to hear his devotees' prayers. Someone was reporting to him on the progress of things. Everything was going very smoothly. The mortal named Noros was doing well. He deserved to be promoted to Holy Spirit. With a satisfied smile, Zeus resumed his journey. His chariot sliced through the sky, heading back in the direction from which he had come. Left behind was only the still, waveless ocean. But Zeus did not notice that under the shadow of the sea surface, only after he had finally left, did a figure he had never detected throughout reveal itself. It seems I overthought it. It was just an accident. I thought his strength had secretly improved so swiftly. Even outside Olympus he could detect my presence. Was he here for something else? That would be more normal. If the sovereignty of chaos were so dreadful, I might have to change my mind prematurely. The voice echoed faintly, as the shadow slightly relaxed. However, he still planned to delay his own journey a bit, at least until Zeus had finished what he was here to do. He had just peeked at the envelope that had flown up from the sea. It was a wedding invitation. The bride was Nereus's daughter. The groom was someone he had no recollection of. Regardless of who it was, this meant that the place would likely be bustling for quite a long time, and Zeus would surely return. To prevent any accidents, it was better to be cautious. As for his own plans, he did not want anyone to find out. With that thought, the shadow flashed away toward a more distant part of the ocean. Thousands of years ago, at the end of that accidental adventure, he had seen a special scene on the way back. At that time, he did not pay it much attention. After all, it was just a minor issue, and besides, he had injuries to deal with. But now it was different. After all, the god of the ocean had an ongoing feud that spanned an era with the lineage of the ancient sea god, so the latter would not attend the wedding. It was a good time to adjust the order of his own actions. Athens, Acropolis. Compared to half a month ago, This city closest to Athens was once again witnessing a massive influx of people. Tens of thousands of visitors from various city-states and countries were pouring in for an imminent conference. All kinds of activities, foreign goods, and exotic clothing were everywhere, and although the real competition had not yet begun, the prelude was already taking place all over the city. Most of these were speeches, poetry competitions, or discussions about certain issues. After all, those who were already famous might directly have the qualifications to join this conference. But for those who did not want to merely be spectators, they probably needed to do something to earn an entry ticket. Not just them, you also need a ticket. Lane, who had just upgraded himself a few days ago, seemed in great spirits. He looked at Andrea, whom he had disguised beyond recognition, and felt very satisfied with his handiwork. Your lineage will allow you a place in the audience, but that doesn't mean you can participate as a contestant, since this isn't a contest of strength. So, you need to make everyone aware of you and think of you as a rare sage. But I am a woman, frowning, Andrea said. The goddess of wisdom is also a woman, and besides, this is Athens, your father's old lover is also the queen of the Amazons. So, if it's just about going on stage, that's merely a minor obstacle. But I probably am not as clever as you think. I can't make people see me as a learned sage, nor can I ensure victory on stage, especially if your disguise doesn't truly fool the deities. Otherwise, we both might end up sentenced to death by fire for blasphemy. Rejecting again, the little princess looked at her new look in the mirror. Elegant and charming, almost appearing a decade older, she was memorable, though the demeanor was still slightly off, given her actual youth. You don't need to worry about that either. I'm having you participate because you are both demigoddess and compliant, and temporarily, no one else can replace you. In fact, your path to fame is already planned by me. There won't be any problem. Moreover, even if you do get the chance to participate, you probably won't need to actually go on stage. Chapter 600 Opening and Game _2. Shaking his head with a smile, Lane said indifferently, "In fact, as long as the winner isn't an Athenian, I don't care who ends up winning." Though he said this, Lane felt that the victor of this grand competition would definitely be an Athenian, or even simply a follower of Athena. Perhaps the very reason the competition was held in Athens was to make such an outcome appear more reasonable. As to why this was, Lane wasn't sure. So if the outcome couldn't be changed, then he would put someone he could control in their place. Even if what you say makes sense, but assuming none of these are an issue, why don't you go up there yourself? With a raised eyebrow, Andrea asked once more. Well, that's because it's dangerous, of course. With concise words, Lane smiled in the face of Andrea's accusing gaze. Just like you said, what if I get exposed? But you probably won't get burned at the stake. Anyway, captive miss, go ahead, you are already a learned person. With what I've taught you, you should be able to sweep these so-called wise men. Where the danger came from needed no explanation. The disguise art that Lane used, empowered by the serpent of the central court, could fool almost everyone, but it was highly doubtful whether it would work in front of those great or nearly great beings. After all, he wasn't a deity specifically in charge of disguises, and his ability in this arena relied entirely on brute force and the authority lent by Keto, who had joined the Nine Hells long ago. By contrast, Andrea was different. She was the princess of Athens. Even if Zeus or someone else recognized her identity, they would probably think it was an arrangement made by Athena behind the scenes. As for sweeping the wise, Lane could only say that philosophy might not vary much from ancient to modern times, and no one can guarantee that some clever person might have an epiphany, but mathematics was different. No one should suddenly have an epiphany in mathematics, right? He mused silently. Before him, Andrea turned after a standoffish look and helplessly walked towards the wooden table that had been prepared not far away. At this moment, a large crowd had already gathered around that table, with a big sign inclined at the side of the road. People were whispering among themselves, while a large stack of gold coins was displayed on the table. In the current world, the circulation of gold was much lower than that of silver, but in many places the consumption of gold was higher than that of silver. Whether for the construction of the temple or the preparation of certain alchemy products, a large amount of gold would be consumed, resulting in an Athenian gold stater not only officially priced at 20 large silver coins but also commonly inflated by 50% in actual transactions. A big stack of gold coins laid out like this was akin to placing millions of cash on a street in later times. The visual impact was quite strong. And right beside the wooden table, there was another open box filled with gold coins. This was almost like having a cash transport truck without guards nearby, loaded with money, next to a stack of millions in cash. If this wasn't the Acropolis of Athens, where the grand event was about to take place, someone would have probably been tempted to do something already. Ahem. Excuse me. Make way, ladies and gentlemen. Please make way. Feeling somewhat nervous inside, but recollecting the so-called mathematical knowledge hastily learned last night, Andrea nevertheless mustered up the courage to make her way through the crowd towards the back of the table. Although she had previously stated that her wisdom was not up to standard, as a follower of Athena, who wouldn't be proud of their intelligence? Now, with an opportunity to try her hand, the little princess was actually quite excited. "Are you the owner of this newly opened gambling house?" The crowd parted as they were told. They had been waiting here for a long time. Not long ago, they had heard that someone had set up a wooden table and was willing to bet against anyone who came here, with the stakes being 1/10 of their wealth. If they lost, well, there was no need to speak of that. But if they won, they could claim 100 times their stake from the other party. No one doubted the ability to pay because shiny gold coins can't be counterfeited. "Yes, sir, but this can hardly be called a gambling house, since I'm the only one here. And this isn't really gambling. It's just a game." Circling to the other side of the table, Andrea put forth an unripe smile that paradoxically made it all the more distracting under her present guise. "Would anyone like to give it a try? How can I be sure you'll stick to the bet?" Without even asking what the game was, it was clear that the young man speaking had been blinded by the allure of the gold coins. In response to his question, Andrea simply placed a sacred badge of Athena on the table and spread her hands. Clearly, there were people who dared to cause trouble in front of the sacred emblem of the deity. After all, the sacred emblem was not the statue of a god, and even the statue of a god might go unnoticed by the deity. But in the Acropolis of Athens, if anyone dared to break a promise in front of the sacred emblem, even if goddess Athena did not descend punishment, the streets full of godhood practitioners and guards would not be pushovers. The goddess as a witness, huh? But I wonder, what are the rules of this game? If it's heavily in favor of the house, I'm better off keeping my distance. Another voice raised in skepticism, belonging to a middle-aged businessman who appeared harmless. But no one would really believe he was anything like a simple lamp. However, Andy remained calm and composed. She reached out and smoothed the stack of gold coins across the wooden table. The dazzling gold light shook the hearts of those watching, even drawing more people from a distance to the scene. "The game is very simple. Place 3 rows of gold coins on the table. There's no limit to the number per row. The participants in the game take turns taking gold coins with me. Each time you can only take from 1 row, at least 1, with no upper limit, and the person who takes the last coin wins." "Oh, right." As if recalling something, Andrea said with a smile. "To be fair, if it's me who decides the number of gold coins in each of the 3 rows at the start, then the participant will be the first to take the gold coins. Conversely, if you plan to arrange a reasonable opening setup yourself, then I will be the first to take the gold coins. There shouldn't be any objections to such rules, right?" As her words ended, a wave of discussion erupted on the spot, but no one found anything wrong with it. It was a completely fair and reasonable act, just as the gambling game with the 12-sided dice that's popular in the mortal realm now, where the person rolling the dice can't guess the number. The same goes in reverse. "All right, I'm in." The one who spoke was the same young man who had spoken earlier. He immediately sat down at the table, threw a large money pouch onto the table surface, and even had a document that Andrea glanced at, which was proof that the other party promised to mortgage their house in the city. Theoretically, that thing had no legal effect. But if it was written in front of Athena's sacred emblem in full view of everyone, it would become binding even if it originally had none. "Are you sure this represents 1/10 of your wealth?" With a skeptical look, Lane was not in need of money now, and Andrea was not truly there to earn money but to make a name for herself, which was why she had stipulated that only 1/10 of the wealth be wagered. But no matter how you looked at it, this did not seem like 1/10. What? Can you tell at a glance how much money I have? The young man waved his hand, clearly not intending to pull back. 100 times. This was practically a game to change one's fate, and he might only encounter this opportunity once in his life. He knew others were still watching, but he could not wait. Well then, your move or mine? Good words cannot persuade a damned soul. Andrea remembered Lane's words of caution from the start of the day. Lay aside the desire to help, respect the fates of others. The moment this chest of gold coins was placed here, many outcomes were already destined. I'll go. The young man who spoke was not about to let this opportunity slip. Who knew if arranging the coins could involve some cheating? He'd heard that the 12-sided dice had plenty of ways to have an unfair advantage, mostly requiring a personal touch. So he decisively took the gold coins and arranged 3 rows on the table. It's said that the simpler things are, the more they rely on luck, so the young man did not intend to lay out long rows of dozens of gold coins. He just prepared a number that seemed neither too many nor too few. Sweating slightly from his back, as he placed the last gold coin, the young man's hands were a bit shaky. The game that would decide his fate was right in front of him. He took a deep breath as if using his voice to cover up his nervousness. I'm ready, you start. All right. Without further ado, Andrea's gaze swept over and a string of ones flashed through her mind. Then she reached out and decisively took 2 gold coins from the second row. Chapter 601 Binary and the Young Odysseus. 2 gold coins were taken out, and the situation on the table was immediately changed. Sitting opposite Andrea, the young man's brain was rapidly turning over. The onlookers were equally noisy, making a loud clamor. After all, whether the first challenger won or lost, the chips he had bet were doomed to not take away all the prizes, not even close to 1/10. Thus, they also wanted to take this opportunity to ponder the solution to the game, hoping to seize this chance to get rich quick, or to show off their abilities in front of everyone. However, unfortunately, although everyone was deep in thought, mathematics is not something you can understand just by thinking, especially for those who barely have any basics. Under extreme tension or anger, one might be able to do a lot, but definitely not solve a math problem. I will take 1 from the first row. The voice was trembling, and just at the beginning, the young man had already started to sweat. The spectators were just watching the excitement, but only he himself knew the kind of pressure that came with gambling all his net worth. He wanted to move a gold coin with his hand, but his trembling arms couldn't accomplish anything. He had no choice but to speak out his intention. Understood. Nodding her head, Andrea reached out and took a gold coin from the first row, then calculated in her heart. -4 - 1 + 2 is equal to -3. My turn. Speaking again, when it was her turn, Andrea took 3 gold coins from the third row, and thus the situation on the table changed again. In just 2 or 3 moves, the number of gold coins on the table had already significantly diminished, but the increasingly tense young man still couldn't see the outcome, and most of the surrounding spectators couldn't figure it out either. Only a few of the obviously well-dressed onlookers, although silent, sighed inwardly. About this game, they didn't yet understand its intricacies, but as professionals of not a low level, even by using the most basic brute force method, they could see that when the situation was at 3-2-1, the person who went first was already doomed to lose. Indeed, when the young man once again took 2 gold coins from the first row, Andrea immediately took away the remaining 2 from the third row. At this point, with only 1 gold coin left in each of the 2 rows, everyone understood the outcome of the bet. No, impossible. You cheated. You schemed against me. Trembling, the young man stood up from his chair, took a step back, and then lunged forward. He wanted to snatch back the chips he had placed on the table, but Andrea did not reach out to stop him. But the next moment, a sharp spear was at the young man's neck. Clearly, to pull off such an event in the city, it was impossible not to notify the city guards, as the Acropolis of Athens had recently seen an influx of newcomers, and they had to prevent casualties at places where crowds gathered. Normally, the guards only maintained order. They didn't care what people did in the city. But the young man's attempt to openly break the covenant made before the sacred badge of the goddess was obviously not acceptable to these order-maintaining guards. This was a fair and just game. I had already stated all the rules in advance. Having successfully completed the first round, Andrea's tense heart also relaxed a lot. A surge of confidence welled up inside her, and as she watched the desperate young man put down his money bag and covenant, staggering backwards under the menacing gaze of the guard's sharp weapons, Andrea's heart didn't rise with any feelings of mercy. As the goddess witnessed, she only demanded 1/10 of the wealth, which would not bring too painful a loss to a person. Since it was the other party who tried to deceive the deity first, it was not surprising that he ended up in such a plight. Setting aside the wealth left by the young man, Andrea gestured that these would also be included in the bet of the game. As she won more and more rounds, this stake was likely to grow as well. Next, who wants to try? With a smile, Andrea looked forward to the crowd, having already found fun in it. And from the crowd, 2 more people stepped out quickly, both wanting to start the next round. However, both of these people's bets weren't too large. Even if they won, they wouldn't be able to win all the box of gold coins, completely leaving a chance for the second person, so they very politely decided the order of play. To this, Andrea just felt, you guys are probably overthinking it. In this game, there's no way you could win. Round after round, soon Andrea had won several times in succession. However, later on, each round took longer and longer. This wasn't intentional procrastination, nor was it because she couldn't calculate fast enough, but simply because the later players all chose enormous amounts of gold coins to pile on the table. Even later on, there were quite a few rows with hundreds of coins. In this situation, the duration of the rounds naturally extended, yet the result was no different. Andrea triumphed in every encounter, and the more she played, the more exhilarated she became. By her side, the pile of won bets grew higher and higher. Consequently, this game, she proclaimed, only the truly wise could decipher, spread to more people's ears, attracting even more onlookers. During this time, it wasn't that no one ever questioned the fairness of the game, but Andrea simply and openly declared that if someone could solve the secret of her victory, that would also be considered winning the bet. Chapter 602 Binary and the Young Odysseus _2. So, those who considered themselves clever flocked together, gathering around the small wooden table and watching one after another attempt the challenge. Some even secretly played their own games with others, trying to peer into its secret. However, just like the game of Gamoku that would appear in later ages, although it was a game with a guaranteed winning strategy, those who didn't understand it still played back and forth. At one point, many even believed that Andrea had truly won her victories through her own wisdom. Looks like I've won again. The corner of her mouth rose unconsciously as Andrea picked up the last gold coin from the table. But this time, she didn't rush to call the next person, nor did she pay attention to the aristocrat who lost in front of her. Instead, she looked up at the sky. The sunset was imminent. The day was about to pass. The day's mission was completed to perfection, and all that remained was to best a few more well-known individuals drawn by the wind of her reputation. Then Andrea would truly become famous all at once. She tempered her slightly excited mood, smiling politely at the crowd. She didn't care about fame for its own sake, but she enjoyed the process of earning fame through her own capabilities. Although the ability was learned, but apart from the ancient gods born with knowledge, who else's knowledge isn't learned? Ladies and gentlemen, it's getting late today, so my game shall end here for now, but don't worry, I'll be back tomorrow. Now that the Acropolis has gathered so many wise people from the mortal realm, and aristocrats from all countries are converging here to compete in wisdom and justice at the Great Assembly, I believe surely someone will be able to unlock my secret, right? Otherwise, I think the contest of wisdom can be declared over. Of course not, your tricks will be seen through. A snort came from right in front of her as the recently defeated young aristocrat carelessly pushed his bet forward, glaring at Andrea's smooth face. My good friend, the Prince of Ithaca, Odysseus, has also arrived in Athens. Having heard of the grand gathering in Athens during his travels across the continent, he came here, planning to offer the championship as a gift to the deities. His resourcefulness is known to all, and he is also universally recognized as a compelling orator, a speaker. And maybe soon, he will find some time to see through your deceptive schemes. Then let him come, Odysseus. I have heard of him, but now I must be going. In just half a day's time, Andrea felt her confidence grow by more than a little. She lifted her head slightly, giving a small nod with her chin, then gestured for the people to make way. As for the wealth that remained there, now, the guards of Athens surely would not let the treasure be stolen and tarnish the kingdom's reputation. Humph, you'll see. Stepping aside, the young aristocrat made no indecent moves. He too had seen, just like the many currently debating and competing in the city, that this game was probably a similar tactic, even more formidable perhaps. If no one could solve her game, others might have no choice but to admit that she was indeed wiser than themselves in some respects. However, this was not going to happen. Compared to the confidence Andrea had built up in one day, he had more faith in his friend. Odysseus's virtues and wisdom were so profound that they won over the young aristocrat, who believed that, should he be willing to come forth, the result was destined. Yay! I'm so happy! With her thoughts flowing within her heart, Andrea walked back to the place they had rented with a light step. She was still a little nostalgic for the feeling of being the center of attention, that mix of admiring, envious gazes, or the challengers who were not convinced. Then, she could thoroughly defeat them and enjoy the pleasure that came with victory. This was a feeling she had never had before as a princess. In the past, everyone respected her, but that was the limit. Their respect came either from her father or from the deity's favor. But this time, everything came from herself. Thud. Ack. Holding her forehead, Andrea glared at Lane, who was nonchalantly sipping tea. The striking technique, a common divine art, was originally used to trigger traps or explore secret chambers, but it was also very effective for knocking people. Calm your mind, captive miss, you must understand. You are merely using the knowledge I taught you to outwit primitives. There's nothing to be proud of. And your victory is fundamentally because they are still playing the game with you within the rules. You've read history. Surely you know the story of the Queen of Thebes, right? I understand, Mr. Avon. Pouting, Andrea sat down on the chair across from Lane. Though she disliked such violent reminders, what Lane said made a lot of sense. Thebes, that was the city-state kingdom founded by Cadmos, the renowned city builder and founder who had helped the divine king during the chaos brought by Typhon. The trading caravan they had encountered on their journey had set out from there. This Phoenician hero ultimately failed to find his sister Europa, and perhaps knowing it was the god king's doing, he chose to remain silent in the end. Anyway, he married the daughter of the goddess of beauty, the goddess of harmony, and continued his lineage in the mortal realm. Reportedly, Aphrodite was quite unhappy about that. She did not wish her daughter to marry a mortal, but perhaps Zeus wanted to show his fairness in reward and punishment, so this outcome was not changed in the end. Chapter 603 Binary and the Young Odysseus _3. However, this was just the beginning. Thebes could be considered one of the most troubled city-states in the history of the mortal realm, whether it was an act of clandestine vengeance by the goddess of beauty or possibly instructed by the divine king himself. Just like the Queen Lane just mentioned, in an era where having many children was seen as a capability, that woman who had given birth to 7 sons and 7 daughters had once been proud and complacent. She even thought that the gods were nothing special. That was the case with the black-robed goddess Leto in the heavens, who had only one son, Apollo. That's what she thought, and so she said to her entourage. And then, unfortunately, Leto overheard. Enraged by the sting to her pride, the goddess of Titans sent her son to use his unparalleled archery skills to shoot dead the queen's 7 sons one by one, and then in front of her to shoot dead her 7 daughters. From this, it is apparent that a competition only has meaning within the rules, but without the protection of rules, it is merely a joke. Tell me, did you surpass anyone special today or encounter any trouble? Seeing that Andrea had calmed down, Lane didn't plan to lecture the 12-year-old girl too much. He had not stayed to watch the entire day's gambling, so now he wanted to check if there was any more valuable information. No, this is the first day. The news has probably not spread yet, and basically those who came were some unknown fellows. After a moment of recollection, Andrea shook her head but then seemed to remember something. However, before I left, someone said they would bring Odysseus as my opponent tomorrow. I have heard of him. He is the Prince of Ithaca and he is very capable. You know him, right? I know. Hearing this familiar name, Lane felt no particular emotional change. Odysseus, he certainly knew of him. A significant part of the subsequent historical accounts about chaos mythology was centered around him. However, by that time, Odysseus was already an adult and had inherited the throne of Ithaca. He had once led the Greek alliance, was the proposer of the Trojan horse strategy, and after 10 years of war and 10 years adrift at sea, returned to his homeland to face a group of enemies who thought he had died and had taken over his kingdom. But in terms of the volume of mythological records, he may not be much less featured than Hercules himself. But that was the Odysseus of later years. There weren't many explicit records of his younger days. If it's him, he probably will not follow the rules of the game. He is not one to play by the book. Smiling, Lane looked at the little princess before him. So how well have you mastered the dual binary balancing method I taught you? If there are more than 3 lines of gold coins, can you still figure it out? Of course. I am very good at mental arithmetic. With a slight lift of her chin, she quickly shrank back into her seat under Lane's gaze. Since Andrea was so confident, Lane decided to take her word for it. Since you are so confident, let's leave it at that. If you surpass Odysseus, you should have won half of the tournament already. Winning half is essentially the same as winning it all, for Andrea is a priest of Athena. Others might not see through this disguise, but Zeus probably could. So as long as her performance in the subsequent competitions was passable, that was actually enough. If the Divine King really planned to do something, as long as it involved Athens, Andrea was almost certain to be chosen. Chapter 604. Changes and Discord. The next day, perhaps because of the spread and fermentation of the news from the previous day, when Andrea returned to yesterday's location, she found the environment had dramatically changed. A huge umbrella-like structure had been erected, shielding the sunlight, and the original crude wooden table had been replaced with exquisite courtly furnishings. 2 rows of guards stood on both sides, and the quality of the onlooking crowd had noticeably improved. Those who had come out of speculation the day before were nowhere to be seen, or rather, they didn't have the qualifications to approach. Now, those waiting here were those who possessed a bit of fame and learning. Miss Leah, your actions yesterday caught the attention of the high echelons of the church. Anyone who reveals their own wisdom will be valued by the Church of Knowledge. Today, your game will be conducted under our supervision to maintain order, and furthermore, will accommodate your reasonable demands. Thank you if necessary. After nodding her thanks, Andrea immediately sat down at the table. Is this what it feels like to be respected by others based on one's own merit? It was quite gratifying. Without wasting any time, she sat up straight and said, "A day has passed. I suppose you can hardly wait, so let the game commence now. Yesterday no one could defeat me. I expect that today, the wise men of the mortal realm won't disappoint me either." The atmosphere immediately turned serious as her words fell. This direct intellectual challenge clearly incited the anger of those present. And noticing this, Andrea stealthily glanced at Lane in the crowd. Although Lane had changed his appearance, she could still recognize him. In fact, many of the things she said over the past 2 days had been taught to her by Lane. If it were up to her alone, she would not have been able to say such things. Yes, that's correct. Feeling inspired, Andrea's spirits soared. After crossing a few streets and then lightly leaping, he arrived on top of a building, under the helpless gaze of his guard. Odysseus, standing tall above, watched Andrea, who was surrounded by layers of people. A trace of astonishment flickered at the base of his eyes. The young prince hadn't expected to find such a beautiful girl here. He had heard about a princess named Helen from the far-off Sparta, a land of warriors dominated by great slave masters, whose beauty was widely known. The prince had never seen Helen, but he thought the girl in front of him was the most beautiful in his eyes. "What, Odysseus, are you smitten with her? That won't do." A complaint rang from beside him as the young aristocrat mowed put his arm around his friend's shoulder. I was counting on you to reclaim my honor, and I've already declared that. You can't back down now. Cough. What are you thinking? There's no backing down. Startled by his friend's voice, Odysseus gave a light cough to gather himself. I have no thoughts about her. Just observing her facial expressions when facing her opponent. Okay, even if I did, I would have to defeat her first. It must be said, the mature appearance Lane molded for Andrea was indeed stunningly attractive, especially considering it paired an adult look with a 12-year-old soul, a perfect example of a contrasting demeanor that unsettled many upon first meeting. But this was the pinnacle of mortal beauty that could be achieved. Anything further entered the extraordinary domain. Even the Helen who triggered the War of Troy, in reality, possessed that nearly mind-twisting beauty because she was blessed by the goddess of beauty, and could make an army that had suffered 10 years of bitter warfare conclude she was blameless with just a smile. However, this time it was unlikely that another god would bless her, but considering her original fate, it was hard to tell whether that was good or bad. Winning a beauty's heart with power, Odysseus? It said that the young king of Athens, Theseus, conquered the Amazon queen Hippolyta in just this way. Looks like you want to emulate him, and rightly so, since this is Athens after all. Seeing that Odysseus hadn't given up, Mode relaxed and then teased him with a smile. Cough, Mode. Let's not talk about this yet. Let's watch the game. You told me about the rules earlier, and I tried them out when I went back. What? Have you already deciphered its mysteries? Excited, Mode stopped joking and looked expectantly at his friend. But Odysseus just shook his head. No, not yet. If there's only one row, it's very simple. The first player to act wins. He just needs to reach a point where only 2 gold coins are left in one go. If there are 2 rows, it's also easy to judge. If the initial number of gold coins in the 2 rows is the same, then the second player wins. He just needs to take the same number of coins as the first player to maintain the balance, so the last coin will inevitably end up in his hands. On the other hand, if the number of coins is different in the 2 rows, then the first player wins by just taking away the surplus coins. But 3 rows. It was clear that as the number of gold coins increased, the difficulty of calculation also increased. Given more time, Odysseus felt he could understand, but now he obviously didn't have that luxury. What do you plan to do? With a change in expression, Mode asked nervously. Don't rush me. Don't rush. Mode, in a game where the opponent clearly knows the rules better and is more aware of the loopholes, charging indirectly is the most foolish act. And trying to familiarize oneself with the rules and loopholes is merely what ordinary people would choose. Chapter 605 Changes and Discord _2. A corner of his mouth lifted. Odysseus said with a smile. You have to understand, no matter what, we need to look beyond the surface and see what our opponent truly wants. Her setting up this game is merely to surpass the other contestants before the big competition, not to win money. So, I can certainly take this into account and request her to change the game's rules. Change? Yes. Narrowing his eyes slightly, Odysseus, the man who later orchestrated the Trojan horse, was never one to play strictly by the rules. Since we are to prove wisdom, then let's not play such simple rules. Let's play big. 3 lines are not enough. I want 4 lines, 5 lines, 6 lines, and 1 game is not enough. I want 2 games, 3 games, 5 games. I can't calculate it, but this should be a new domain for her too. Spread out the numbers to minimize the element of pure luck, bring both sides back to the same starting line, and what we're really competing in would be intelligence. Now, that's a smart person's solution, and on this issue, I refuse to lose to her. His words brimmed with confidence. And at that moment, yet another person left defeated, leaving behind the wealth he had staked. And watching Andrea with a self-satisfied smile, Odysseus swung himself off his seat. Winning this game, he would not only secure a half victory before the start of the grand event, but also get to know such a beautiful girl. Not bad at all. Once he returned to his country, he would definitely send a grand gift to Mode. Smack. I appreciate your generosity. Though her words were humble, Andrea's eyes were anything but. With another elder figure, who she couldn't name but identified as a distinguished person from the surrounding conversations. Admitting defeat, Andrea scanned the audience. Mr. Avon had said such words were best saved until after she defeated a well-known individual, as they would carry more impact. Besides, it's not what I wanted to say, it's what he taught me to say. Clutching her small fist, Andrea convinced herself inwardly and then smiled as she spoke. So, who will be the next one? The room fell silent for a moment. What started as a constant rotation had now reached a point where each victory was followed by a brief wait, all within a span of half a day. After a short pause, an older gentleman stepped forward, intending to have a personal try. I will. Thud. Leaping to the ground, Odysseus was the first to speak out, and many in the crowd recognized him. Odysseus! Though she had not seen him before, Andrea recognized the figure who had made a fierce remark to the young aristocrat yesterday and followed him up. So without surprise, the blond youth was the Prince of Qatar, the well-reputed Odysseus. It is I, Miss Leah. I wonder where you come from, for I have never heard of a beautiful girl like you before. Moving 2 steps forward, Odysseus sat opposite Andrea. Unperturbed, he attempted to probe the origins of his opponent. You are not the first to be curious about this, but if you want to know, win against me first. With a slight smile, Andrea spread her hands. Your turn or mine? Naturally, it cannot be yours. Otherwise, just setting up a 1, 2, 3 alignment would make it impossible for me to win. And if it's my turn... Actually, Miss Leah, I feel your game is somewhat unfair. Lifting her gaze from the table, Andrea looked at the overly enthusiastic smiling prince from a foreign land in front of her, expressing her puzzlement. Terms of the bet, 100-fold payout rate. It's unfair to you, Miss Leah. And speaking of the game, this game, which tests calculation and strategy, is predefined under your rules, Miss Leah, making it somewhat unfair to the challengers. I know you're using your monetary disadvantage to compensate for this home field advantage, but if you truly want to demonstrate that your level surpasses all challengers, then shouldn't the game be played with fairer methods? The words of Odysseus set off a buzz among the surrounding crowd. Indeed, everyone knew that by setting up this game, Andrea might have studied it for months or even years in advance, using this temporal advantage to her benefit. Before, considering the 100-fold payout, no one paid attention to this detail, and it was like exploiting a psychological loophole. But now, it was apparent the Prince of Qatar was a skilled debater as he easily pointed out the flaw. So what are you suggesting? Feeling somewhat anxious inside, Andrea maintained her composure. On the contrary, she even appeared entirely at ease. But this didn't fool Odysseus. With an inward chuckle, the young prince spoke loudly. I won't take advantage of you. I will match your wager with an equivalent amount of wealth. But likewise, I require you to compete with me on an even playing field. 3 lines of gold coins are too simple, too prone to patterns. I want to increase the number and the frequency of the games. Is it just that? Suddenly relieved from her earlier anxiety, Andrea relaxed considerably. Leaning against the chair back, she said with a smile, if that's the case, I can accept your request. Just if you want to bet the same amount of wealth, you might have to double the stake with every defeat. Chapter 606 Changes and Discord _3. Goddess be my witness, even if I don't have enough wealth now, I will repay you in the future. This is Odysseus's promise. Having made a solemn promise, under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Odysseus spoke in a deep voice. Can this new game begin now? Of course, feel free, but the outcome will be no different. With a slight smile, Andrea felt a bit sentimental for a moment. This feeling of intellectual domination, truly fascinating indeed. The grand assembly in the mortal realm was still fervently underway, and preparations for the wedding at sea had also begun. But these were merely spectacles of the surface world. Below ground, there was nothing. Even the invitations sent out by the divine king seemed intentional or accidental in avoiding the gods of the underworld, as if they didn't exist at all. Under the light of the nether moon, the corners of the underworld remained perpetually desolate. The waters of the Styx rolled onward, with countless souls churning and struggling within. By a large poolside, a gray-robed goddess watched the contorted and despairing souls in the water, and couldn't help but find it somewhat amusing. Such are humans, arrogant and ignorant. The closer they are to the gods, not only do they fail to be grateful, but they even attempt to challenge and deceive. If not for their offering of faith, perhaps they would have been destroyed by the gods once again. What are you watching? Is this Tantalus? Unbeknownst to others, Moanda, now the goddess of life of Olympus, previously the embodiment of the golden apple tree, appeared beside the lake. She followed the gaze of the gray-robed goddess and naturally saw that madman who had cooked his own son to serve as a dish to all gods, a son of Zeus. As eternal beings, all gods always mastered numerous eternal forms of punishment over the long eons, just like the one at hand. They transformed Tantalus's flesh into fruit trees, his blood into pool water, and then locked his soul in the water, subjecting him to cold and hunger. Only his chin was above the water's edge, the fruit tree's bent branches hanging over his head. Yet, whenever he tried to drink, the water's surface would drop, just a fraction out of his reach. And when he tried to eat, the wind would blow the branches up, letting the fruits drift just beyond his reach. Forever unattainable, compounded by an ageless eternity, this was all God's punishment for him. "You asked to meet me here. What does that mean?" smiled Moanda. "I just wanted to tell you that, as gods of the underworld, we may not have much presence, but we do have one advantage. Living long enough." Eris spoke softly, being one of the oldest deities, elder to all but the primordial titans and primordial gods. However, they often noticed things that the powerful ones did not, like once beside Mother Earth, there also existed someone called Moanda. "Is that so? That's truly remarkable." Moanda responded, not sensing any sincerity and seemingly unfazed by the other's probing. But Eris had just asked casually, and she didn't actually plan to do anything. After all, this enmity between former master and servant seemed to align perfectly with the discordant goddess's intentions. "According to the divine king's wishes, hand it over to me." Eris spoke indifferently, stretching out her hand, and Moanda said nothing. She simply flipped her palm, and a golden apple, glowing with light, appeared in her hand. Chapter 607 3 times. Ever since the change of eras, the trace of the golden apples has never been seen in the world again. The original reserves were depleted by Zeus and his brothers, and the newly born one became an instrument for Moanda's reincarnation. Once she completed her reincarnation, she was even less likely to bear any fruit with her own body. For a plant, fruiting itself is an act that consumes strength, even for the golden apple tree, the first plant of the world. Moanda had no intention of following such a meaningless instinct. Even the existences that called themselves dark elves. If it weren't for the will of Erebus, she would not have thought of creating them. After all, although they indeed brought her a considerable amount of faith, the goddess of life was actually the one among the Olympian gods who least lacked faith. Among the three deities worshipped at the Oracle of Delphi, Mother Earth, the giver of life to all spirits, had always been present. But with the transfer of the life face, this fixed faith also shifted along with it. That is to say, in the golden apple tree, there was not just one will but two, a primordial one existing alongside Moanda, leading to the actual ownership of life and plant on the material side not being entirely hers. Otherwise, whether Athena was truly the strongest under Zeus, that might really be a matter for debate. Golden apples, truly the miracle of creation. Despite having just probed into Moanda's origins, Eris's gaze still lost focus for a moment as she looked at the treasure exuding the aura of life before her. This was also her first personal contact with this legendary food, and she even felt that the records passed down among the gods probably underestimated its presence. In her impression, golden apples should only be capable of reshaping the bodies or healing the wounds of deities, or helping true gods quickly reach the limit allowed by their innate divine positions. That was already an extraordinary ability, but at this moment, Eris felt a longing. Intuition told her that this golden apple might have even more wondrous effects. Was the rumor mistaken, or was it different from the original ones? "This is it," She nodded to herself and confirmed the existence of the golden apple. Hand it over to me. According to our agreement, I shall. What do you mean by this? Taking a step forward, Eris was ready to take it, but Moanda stepped back, avoiding her grasp. Are you going to break our agreement? I don't really mind since I originally did not want to do this. Of course not, but as a member of Olympus, how could I give a golden apple to a deity of the underworld to stir up discord within the divine court? Shaking her head, facing the goddess's questioning, Moanda just smiled. She caressed the fruit in her hand. Then with a gentle toss in front of Eris, she threw the golden fruit into the nearby lake. The lake water splashed a bit, and the tortured soul of Tantalus seemed to notice this scene as he painfully turned his head. Yet he only saw a glint of gold falling into the water and failed to notice two deities who were close at hand. Since you've chosen to meet me here of your own volition, I might as well go along with your wishes, Eris. This golden apple wasn't given by me, but rather you contrived to take it yourself. Before I left the underworld, I left a golden apple for the dark elves, guarded personally by the Dragon Mother as a so-called sacrifice to the primordial gods. However, no one expected that a true god from the underworld would scheme and steal this divine fruit under Hades' insinuation. She evaded the pursuit by utilizing the prison established by the divine king, and then brought the golden apple to the vast ocean. As for her next steps, I'm not so sure. Turning around, Moanda described the process indifferently as if Eris didn't exist at all. The elves and the Dragon Mother, furious at the loss of the divine fruit, encountered the reproach of the primordial gods. Consequently, they swore an oath that only the great Lord of Darkness was worthy of this sacrifice, and no matter who stole it or where it ended up, they would retrieve it. Whoever possesses this golden apple, they are their enemy. Of course, the enemy of their enemy is a friend, and if the opponent is too powerful, they will have to seek some helpers. That's the gist of this affair, and the mortal who has been cursed by all gods just happened to take notice of this matter by coincidence. Which is quite plausible, isn't it? Stunned into silence, Eris was once again shocked by the shamelessness of the celestial deities. She thought only Zeus, who covertly urged her to plot against her kin, was capable of such a deed. But she hadn't expected that Moanda could utter such words with an unchanged expression. It's true that most of the deities of the underworld preside over discord, lies, and doom, but they rarely engage in such activities. It is only because mortals fear them that they fabricate various rumors. What an eloquently justified excuse. In any case, my task is now complete, and what follows is no longer my concern. Unperturbed by the disdainful sneer of the goddess of discord, Moanda turned into a streak of cyan light and flew towards the direction from which she had come. Eris was surprised. She could still feel surprise. Although both of them were divine beings laboring for Zeus, sold by the Lord of Darkness, the other party was indeed diligently taking the blame and working, all the while facing another primordial god. Since the beginning of the world, apart from Earth Mother Gaia, no other two great ones were known to have sworn a relentless hatred, only relenting when wounded and forced into slumber. But it was different with ordinary true gods. Even though Moanda was unsure why Erebus and Zeus suddenly planned to ignite a war in the mortal realm, she didn't want to be the spark. If Eris was smart, she should also find someone to take the fall. No matter how the other side acted, it no longer concerned her. The chip Erebus promised had been paid. The forces he was to dispatch were ready, and she could leave the underworld with her own essence, fully aligning with Olympus. With this thought, Moanda realized she had been sold thrice. The god who resurrected her ignored her, sold her to the Lord of Darkness for some unknown price, and after she created life, Erebus once again sold her to the divine king. The question remains, how long will Zeus be able to hold on this time? No one knew the answer, and thus in the underworld, dominated by dark hues, a transaction destined to be recorded in history books was settled. The wedding feast above the Pontus Euxinus was still being prepared, and the stage was not yet set up, but the preparations beneath it were already halfway done. Smack. If I'm not mistaken, this is the third round, isn't it? Yes, it seems the outcome is not looking good. The prince has already lost 2 rounds. It's hard to say. 2 rounds aren't enough to determine the result. The game is getting more complex. Maybe it's a matter of luck? Who knows? But didn't the woman who arranged the bet say there was a secret in her game? And if someone could decipher it, they too might claim victory. Who can tell if that's true or not? Even the riddle of the Sphinx, the great demon with the body of a lion and the head of a human from legends, I've never heard of a fixed solution. Each riddle it poses is different. It's hard to pronounce. If Prince Odysseus cannot win, perhaps only the goddess of wisdom can see through the mystery behind it all. In the city of Acropolis, the crowd was growing larger. After all, this wasn't a well-constructed grand arena, just a street. Those outside couldn't see what was happening inside. A dense wall of onlookers blocked the view. Fortunately, among these spectators were professionals who naturally had ways to overcome this problem. At this moment, various arcane eyes, birds bound by contracts, and other means of observation were densely packed around the small street, fixing their gaze on the large table at the very center. Coin after coin was being placed on the table, making a smacking sound. This was already Odysseus's 3rd round. Your Highness, it seems the wealth you brought from home is almost depleted. If you lose this round, I'm afraid there'll be no chips left for you to use. After taking a sip of tea and feeling much refreshed, Andrea glanced at the pile of gold coins that had accumulated into a small mountain and couldn't help but offer advice. That was already more than several years' worth of taxes for a city, and Qatar was not some famous great nation. It was just an island country similar to Phoenicia near the Ionian Sea. Keep in mind, the changing stakes of the game required Odysseus to bet wealth of an equal amount, which meant an exponential leap. I know, but most of this is the profit I've accumulated over the years from traveling all countries. I haven't really cared much about the growth of wealth before. Taking a deep breath, the young prince's expression was already extremely serious. He carefully placed another gold coin on the table, where 6 neat rows were arranged from left to right. Intuition tells me that the secret of this game has a very tight connection to the issue of who goes first, so your rules demand, if you aren't the one to arrange the gold coins, then you decide who takes first. Sadly, I still haven't figured out the mystery behind that. Raising his hand to indicate he was done, Odysseus watched his opponent closely. Although he started off quite relaxed, even wanting to get to know this beautiful girl named Leah, by now he had come to regard Andrea as a worthy opponent. He took note of her contemplation. It seemed as if she were calculating something, then unhesitatingly took away a corresponding amount of coins. Unfortunately, he still could not understand what she was calculating. Miss Leah, what do you plan to do afterward? If no one can solve your game, are you going to spread it as a puzzle to the world? I don't know, but at least before the end of this assembly, I have no intention of revealing the answer. Chatting idly, Andrea was unaware of the prince's changing thoughts. After all, since she learned the algorithm of the game, she knew no matter what, she was bound not to lose. The only exception would be if someone could detect the pattern and win that way. Yet, people of this era, maybe due to their architectural needs, had achieved a little in terms of geometric composition, but that was it. So, not half an hour later, Andrea won the round again. Rustle. Clang. When the 3rd round ended, a large amount of wealth was dumped onto the side. A small mountain of it, which even included a very lavish-looking treasured sword. Odysseus's face was covered with quite a bit of sweat as he looked somberly at the empty table. He had a vague sense that the existence of who went first was meant to maintain some kind of balance, and as long as this balance existed, no matter how he took the coins, he would never win the game. In principle, he could give up, but he had just come to understand a little something, which made the prince unwilling to end it there. Touching his empty waist, perhaps a bit caught up in the moment, Odysseus gritted his teeth slightly. In the next round, if I lose, I will bring enough stakes to you later, and if we ever become enemies in the future, I will yield 3 times to you. Then let's continue. Indifferently speaking, Andrea nodded her head. So the 4th round began and, as expected, ended. The result was no different. The little princess won the ultimate victory again. Chapter 608 begin. Under the sun, there was seldom anything new in the Acropolis, but this time was an exception. An entire city was stumped by a game, and it might even evolve into the smartest people in the mortal realm being baffled by a game, a truly unprecedented event. As expected, this was bound to become yet another legendary story passed down through the ages and relished by people, although it did not involve slaying demons or quelling disasters. Its associated fame might well be no less than that of the former. In fact, among certain groups this was even considered a bonus. So what changes will this bring about? Compared to those before her, she doesn't have as many distractions. Lane pondered silently in his temporary residence, looking at the sun outside the window. Different from a millennium ago, if the original sun drawn by the golden chariot was just a metaphor, with the two connected by some special means of movement, the current one was a genuine sun chariot. A light source was suspended at the rear of the frame, and although it might not be as large as the original sun, it was closer to the ground. What hung there now was the dusk sun, its rays carrying a sense of decay and ruin. It was an aspect of authority that even the ancient god of sun had not controlled during his lifetime. Or perhaps it was precisely because he was shattered that the sun henceforth acquired this symbolic attribute. Non-gods becoming quasi-gods. There is indeed a precedent for this. Perseus was such a case. He slew the Gorgon under the guidance of all gods, possessed divine blood, and eventually ascended, though he never had a realm of authority exclusive to himself, just like the various other constellations that later ascended. Moreover, it seems their actions were restricted. Often, there are only records of their ascension, without any substantial legacy. Pandora. She was the same. The disasters of the mortal world originated from the all-gods, and she merely played the role of a tool in this context. So, until a millennium ago when I left, she had shown no signs associated with gaining authority. So, the so-called great achievements, great fame actually cannot directly bring about true authority, at least not on their own. Something is definitely missing, something that I have overlooked. And Heracles, I wonder if he has been born yet. The great hero wasn't the only immortal mortal, but he was indeed the only one suspected to have possessed the authority of strength. Moreover, the authority of strength has an owner. Theoretically, there is no situation other than the world itself where godhood is usurped. So the origin of this Heracles is very debatable. Or is it truly just a title and he never actually possessed real authority? I hope that's not the case. For if it is, it would be bitterly disappointing. Creak. As Lane was lost in thought, the door was pushed open, emitting a slight noise. It has to be said, the bearing design of this era was truly average. From the palaces of the deity down to the doors of the mortal realm, it seemed there were no doors that didn't make a sound. Avon, I'm back. Andrea strode through the door and into the room. She looked left and right, then, as expected, saw the familiar figure at the table. Back so soon? It seems you've got what you needed. Without looking up, Lane didn't expect any surprises over such a small matter. The gap in eras was so vast, Andrea was certain to win by a landslide, as long as she didn't get too nervous and mess up herself. However, Lane's indifferent attitude cooled the little princess's excited mood considerably. Yes, I beat Odysseus, the prince of Qatar I mentioned to you yesterday, who is quite famous. After he lost, I did as you said, announcing that these challengers were too poor in skill, and that in the future, I wouldn't accept competitions from ordinary people, nor would I wait there anymore. Biting her lip, Andrea sat opposite at the table. After calming down, she also felt a bit worried. The head of the Acropolis Church, who is also a friend of the chief shepherd, intends to meet me and invite me to participate directly in the final round of the grand contest. I won't be recognized, will I? Under normal circumstances, you certainly would be. Even if appearances differ, some habitual actions could still be recognized by acquaintances. After all, you haven't undergone any professional training. But when you make such a big name for yourself, people are less likely to connect you with the missing princess. After all, whatever skills you have, your acquaintances would be all the clearer about them. Lane's implication was clear. You were so weak before, and the difference from now is apparent at a glance. No one would naturally equate you with the former Andrea. Although it was the truth, It still felt like an arrow to Andrea's heart upon hearing it. "I get it. You know everything, don't you?" With a humph, the little princess lay down on a small bed nearby, sprawling out in the shape of a star. "But speaking of which, why exactly did you come here and get me to join the competition? What good does it do you if I win the championship?" "That's a secret," Lane said indifferently, with no intention of providing an answer. "That's what you said before. Can't you come up with something different to say?" "Then, it's destiny. Aren't you a bard? Bards can prophesize, that makes sense. Just consider that I am here to save Athens and incidentally, bring peace to the world." He laughed a little while saying that and shook his head slightly. World peace. There probably wasn't a wish harder to fulfill than this in the world. Time flowed like water, and the trajectory of the sun's movement also kept changing according to the star charts. Because of the pomegranate seeds she once consumed, Queen of the Underworld, Persephone, could only stay on Mount of the Gods for the first half of the year, while the latter half would be spent in the netherworld, and with her departure, the entire world would begin to enter deep autumn. The short 2-day game competition was now known to everyone in the city and was even spreading to more distant regions. People called it Leah's Game and speculated about Andrea's origin. After all, she had been invited to attend various soirees more than once in recent days, and her impeccable conduct proved that she had received a good education. Coupled with the strong aura of her bloodline, it all attested to her extraordinary origins. However, no one could truly uncover Andrea's backstory, not even Odysseus who, despite his earlier failure, now frequently visited her. Andrea's history was like a puzzle, shrouded in layers of fog. But these were all just preludes to the grand competition. Days went by and preparations were in full swing. Thousands of contestants with vastly different cultures and identities couldn't possibly stream into the completed venue all at once and then take turns to decide the winner. To save time and space, Athenian officials temporarily drew from the accumulated cases and puzzles in various subordinate cities and prepared hundreds of topics. In alleys, districts, parks, squares, and even in front of theaters, courts, and churches, competitions of all sizes began non-stop, day and night. There were no judges and no one to announce the winners, only soldiers responsible for maintaining order. When a match ended, the audience present cast anonymous votes, reflecting the essence of Athenian classical republicanism. The victors from each competition continued to face off against other victors, while losers did the same with each other. In the end, each contestant's total number of victories was tallied to determine who qualified for the final showdown. This was a scene rarely seen in other kingdoms of the era, or even other parts of Athens, because understanding the debates, the process of solving mysteries, or judging the fairness and legality of verdicts all required a certain level of cultural literacy and refinement. Apart from the largest sanctuary of the Church of Knowledge in the mortal realm, the location of the Parthenon Temple, no other city boasted such a widespread literacy rate. And standing on the towering city walls, a middle-aged man with a hint of irritation in his eyes looked down at the city, feeling somewhat reassured in his heart. He had come here alone. In fact, as the monarch of the kingdom, he hadn't paid much attention to the progress of the grand contest until today. He had many issues on his mind, and the disappearance of his youngest daughter was actually just an insignificant part among them. Because Theseus was well aware that Andrea's kidnapping was merely a facade, what it really represented was the discontent of traditional all countries and their worshipped gods. Athens was too new, its geographic location too advantageous, and many of its chosen practices too unconventional. Chapter 609. Problems and Bad Guests. Under the clear sky, the flow of people was constantly pouring into the Acropolis Convention Center. This newly constructed building leaned against the mountain, with dozens of corridors descending from above, hundreds of rows of seats, and even some skywalks that obviously defy the laws of mechanics. From the very beginning of its design, it was required to accommodate at least 150,000 people simultaneously, which even surpassed the population of some remote small cities. The ingenious design also allowed this vast area to have good ventilation and visibility. When the alchemy pattern was activated, even the audience at the very edge would not be disturbed by the booming voices, clearly hearing the sounds from the floating stage in the center of the venue. This was undoubtedly an architecture that most countries of the world could not construct, even if they exhausted their wealth. The challenge was not just a matter of money, but also a gap in technology. Many guests from all countries were shocked, considering that less than half a year had passed since the decision to construct this building. Even in later generations, erecting a building like this out of thin air in a matter of months would be a difficult feat. In this era, it was nothing short of a man-made divine miracle. I heard that during the construction of the Acropolis Convention Center, no legendary grand sorceress was involved, and the building was largely completed by ordinary spellcasters and craftsmen. Sitting in the player's seat ahead of time, Odysseus turned to the priest who had guided him here and asked. Yes, although more than one interested grand sorceress actively offered help, His Majesty declined their kind offers. Volunteering. I see. Odysseus knew exactly what was going on as he curved the corners of his mouth slightly. It wasn't that those wizards were too agreeable. In fact, as far as he knew, those who could truly reach the legendary status on the path of a spellcaster were extremely rare, and that was also true for godhood practitioners. The scarcity, the irreplaceable capabilities naturally brought higher status, but on such matters, they indeed could offer their help without asking for anything in return. After all, the convention proposed by the God King priest, if held within the building they constructed, would be a rather interesting affair. Speaking of which, Your Excellency, I've always been curious, what is the Church of Knowledge's stance on those with shallow faith who audaciously infringe on the domains of deities, and do you not regard that as a desecration? Hesitating for a moment, Odysseus finally voiced his long-standing question, and the middle-aged priest beside him explained with composure. Your Highness Odysseus, it's actually a misunderstanding by outsiders. We too abhor the act of trespassing into the domains of deities. The issue is, the wizards are not infringing on the goddess's domains. Not. With a somewhat puzzled expression, Odysseus didn't understand the priest's point. Like the special fertilizers invented by alchemists, the crops grown with them are nearly reaching the effects of the exclusive divine arts of the Church of Agriculture. Or, for example, the special alchemical concoctions now on sale in Athens, which can maintain youth and vitality for longer periods, continue to be smuggled into Western countries despite prohibitions by the Church of the Goddess of Beauty and the Heavenly Empress. Such encroachments on the authority of all gods were happening almost every moment, and although their effects were still far from equaling the powers of deities, such acts were intolerable in themselves. The breakthrough from 0 to 1 often might not be too different from 1 to 100. Yes, not. Nodding, the middle-aged priest maintained a gentle demeanor. The goddess is a symbol of wisdom, and whether it is the art of skill or the art of war, they are just extensions of the domain of wisdom. Prince, have you ever found any existence that can truly elevate a person's fundamental wisdom? Wisdom, not intelligence, not memory or comprehension. Odysseus felt like he was beginning to understand the priest's point at this moment. True wisdom had indeed never been infringed upon by humans. On the contrary, all their achievements were proving the importance of wisdom. But then again, can Athena truly elevate the most fundamental wisdom of a life? Odysseus thought, but he clearly wouldn't voice such a sacrilegious question. And besides, how one's true wisdom could be measured was indeed a difficult question to answer. Much of what most people could see was merely the manifestation of experience, personality, memory, and knowledge. If all these were added together, it's uncertain if that would be the true wisdom. Odysseus didn't know. His sudden contemplation of these questions didn't stem from suddenly becoming a philosopher, but rather from being struck by Andrea's previous defeats. After several losses, he didn't stop seeking others for games, even figuring out several supposedly foolproof opening moves, but those were nothing more than rote memorization. Using exhaustive methods to solve a problem, listing all possible options, eventually finding that one side did indeed have a surefire strategy, but he knew the strategy without understanding the rationale. Even though afterwards in facing other opponents, Odysseus achieved more than one victory using eloquence and quick wits, regaining some confidence, it inevitably made him question his own wisdom. Proud of his own stratagems, he once sought to solve the riddle of the Sphinx, but he never achieved a result. Now, he felt perhaps he was too confident. There were always things in the vast world unknown to him. Chapter 6:10. Problems and bad guests _2. Distinguished guests, envoys and citizens from the city-states, kingdoms, and nations of the eastern continent including Phoenicia, Lydia, Phrygia, and others. The assembly is about to commence. Odysseus was situated in a corner of the venue. As he conversed with the priest, a steady stream of people continued to enter the place. It wasn't until the sun reached its zenith that most of the attendees had taken their seats and an elderly man of courtly birth stepped onto the central stage, facing the tens of thousands in the audience. Today, under the eyes of the gods and the rule of the kingdom of Athens, we shall hold a grand ceremony where the wise from all countries will present their talents as offerings before the deities. But before that, there is one more task we must complete, and that is to finalize the theme and the judges for this assembly. Raising his hand, the elder on the hovering platform in the center of the venue pointed towards the sky, and immediately 12 leather scrolls bound together floated in midair. The 12 scrolls, distinguished by different numbers and colors, were so vivid and conspicuous that each viewer could clearly see and take notice of their presence. Everyone has their own thoughts, and the truest form of fairness in adjudication comes not from another but from the guests of the nations themselves. Unlock the topics with wisdom, prove neutrality in your decisions, and persuade us with words, convincing us to believe. This is the best way to judge, and the true winner will have the public's accord. Each topic may have its biases, so we leave everything to fate. Pick the scroll you favor, raise the corresponding card by your seat, and based on that, we will select the final topics and procedures. Now, please be silent. The selection of topics starts now. Whoosh! Waves lapped gently against the calm surface of the sea, creating a series of sounds. Thousands of magnificent carriages streaked across the sky, descending straight down as the sea parted before them. Perhaps due to the arrival of the Earthshaker god, the usually placid Pontus Euxinus turned rough. However, it seemed insignificant and common before the myriad of deities in the sky. What a hasty wedding! Aphrodite mused, picking up a rose and watching it bloom and then wither. To think, from decision to commencement, not even half a year has passed. It's quite the joke. She didn't really want to come here. The specific reasons she wasn't completely sure of. At first, she thought it was an omen from fate, a sign that something undesirable was going to happen on this journey. But later, she recalled more clearly. Her disdain for this place wasn't new. It had started a long time ago. Previously, it was an unconscious reluctance to draw near. But now, she had to come because of the Divine King's command. Such an abrupt wedding, yet personally announced by the Divine King. Could it be that he can no longer restrain himself and intends to break the vows once made, to exert his influence over the great ocean? Aphrodite spoke carelessly, her words hanging in the air while her daughter, Harmonia, the goddess of harmony, stood silently beside her. Her husband, Cadmos, renowned in the mortal realm, was no longer with her. Unable to leave that place, the goddess of harmony spent most of her time alone. Yet, she didn't completely agree with her mother's words. Perhaps due to the nature of godhood, in the eyes of the goddess of harmony, Zeus's connection with the laws of the world had become more harmonious and tighter. This was a good thing, reminiscent of when the second-generation Divine King believed that the Codex of Creation was the most suitable divine artifact for the Divine King. For this special status could endow Zeus with a power far beyond his imagination when facing those who broke the rules. However, this direct connection affected him differently than a divine artifact. The greater the benefits received, the stricter the constraints he had to endure. If anyone in the world would never break their vows or disrupt the order of the divine court, then, in the opinion of the goddess of harmony, it would certainly be Zeus. So regardless of what purpose brought the Divine King here, it definitely wouldn't be to subjugate the ocean with his own power. Forget it, you're always such a bore. Initially, I didn't support you marrying a mortal, but it was the Divine King's command, after all. Yet, I suppose he didn't truly intend to repay that human named Cadmos. Shaking her head, Aphrodite said no more. For much of his life, Cadmos could not speak of good fortune, and both Thebes, which he founded, and the legacy he left behind met with more disasters than luck, Aphrodite herself having played a part in their misfortunes. Regardless, it all belonged to the past. The carriages descended from the parted sea, and Aphrodite, with her daughter, entered the palace of the ancient sea god's lineage under the respectful reception of the sea nymphs at the doorway. Behind her, more deities arrived, including the god of heavenly light and the goddess of daylight, who had been recluse for a long time, had come in person. These were two ancient gods with great divine power, but at the invitation of the divine king, they had come from the stars to the mortal realm. Beyond that, even Aphrodite saw traces of the primordial Titan's deities, with the appearance of the goddess of Luminous, the rarely seen wife of the god of the lightless celestial body. And why did she also come? With a quick glance from the corner of her eye, Aphrodite caught sight of a red hem, but it disappeared as she turned around. The goddess of the magic net, a deity existing outside of the divine court, originally had nothing to do with them, but due to an accident, it seemed that the goddess of beauty had offended her. Since then, Aphrodite had been the frequent target of the others' pranks, each time not seriously harmful, but extremely insulting. Humph! With a cold snort, Aphrodite entered the palace of the sea god. She had planned to wait for Ares, but now she was no longer in the mood. A few sweet words at most, that brute wouldn't remember such matters. As time passed, more and more deities arrived, swelling the crowd. By the time the sun was at its peak, even Apollo had momentarily abandoned his golden chariot, letting it hover in the sky before coming down to the palace. Gradually, the outside of the sea god's palace quieted down again. Without any surprises, the wedding banquet must be about to start. No deity would put on such an air and arrive at this time, so the sea nymph guarding the door relaxed. "Who's there? Come out!" Suddenly, sensing something amiss, the sea nymph before the divine palace tensed up. She fixed her eyes on the distant, somber waves, unconsciously stepping back. In her gaze, a gray-clothed goddess was slowly approaching from afar. The newcomer didn't come in a chariot, but the sea nymph still breathed a sigh of relief. It was all right if it was a deity. She only feared encountering mindless monsters. Deities wouldn't cause trouble at a wedding feast held by the divine king, but the latter kind wouldn't care who the divine king was. "Welcome, your highness, I come from the underworld." The voice held no deception, as Eris spoke indifferently. "No matter where you come from, as long as the divine king. I don't have an invitation. Then may I go in?" "No need." Raising her hand to decline, the goddess revealed a strange smile. She looked at the palace before her and spoke calmly. "Without an invitation, naturally, I need not go in, but since I'm here, I should at least present a gift. You may pass on my gift, whether it is fortune or misfortune for you."